Good morning everybody, my name is Janet Hancock and I work in public services here in the Public Record Office, and I'm going to be doing, well, my main role here is to introduce some of the wonderful speakers we have lined up for you today, and I'm not going to encroach any further on their time. The first session we're going to have this morning is from a range of members of the Royal College of Nursing History of Nursing Network Northern Ireland, and I'm just going to run through them because they're all going to be bringing different voices from a range of different characters to you this morning, and that will include Margaret Graham, chairperson of the History of Nursing Network NI, Heather Thompson, Margaret Kelly, John Maguire and Laura Finlay, and apologies if I've missed anybody, and Cindy, apologies. So they're all going to be delivering some excerpts from the research that they've been carrying out and bringing those voices to life for you. So I'm going to let them all introduce the different characters that they're going to be talking about. So without any further ado, I invite Margaret to come up and join us.
Good morning everybody. My name is Margaret Graham, and on behalf of the Royal College of Nursing History Group, I just wish to thank PRONI for inviting us to present our World War I project. It's a tremendous honour for us to be invited here to celebrate International Women's Day. So just a bit about our history group. It's been an active team of mostly retired nurses, all who have an interest in nursing history. And the group's been active for over 20 years, and many of our team are here today. When established, an early objective was to record the oral histories of nurses who had trained prior to the onset of the National Health Service. And a few years ago, we collected narratives of nurses who had worked through the Troubles. This project culminated in the publication of Nurses' Voices from the Northern Ireland Troubles, which inspired the documentary Nurses on the Front Line, a BBC commissioned programme. After this activity, we didn't have long to sit back and rest, as we soon realised that centenary events were beginning to be held to mark the anniversaries of significant events relating to World War I. And with some media attention being given to nurses and VADs, we felt that we had a duty to find out about the contribution made to the Great War by our own local professionally trained nurses. Another impetus for collating the information was a realisation that for those nurses who had survived their war experience, they would most likely have lived their life with a host of traumatic memories and frequent flashbacks, just as has been for present-day nurses who have worked through the recent Troubles. So just as the nurses that we met who wanted their Troubles experience recorded, we want to have the contribution and the sacrifice those World War I nurses from here made documented and their names remembered. For those of us who had trained at the Royal Victoria Hospital, it was a discovery to find that our nurses' home, Musson House, had been named after Matron Musson, who had not only served in France, but was a decorated World War I nurse and had been mentioned in dispatches. The RVH has no war memorial which we could find, but the City Hospital has a memorial which includes nurses. With Heritage Lottery funding secured and starting from a zero baseline, we gathered information from all quarters: libraries, academic books, military websites, hospital archives. All were searched, and of particular importance was the gathering of information from regional libraries and museums. And as our group is widely dispersed across the province, a broad sweep was made of these. War memorials in towns and churches were inspected for any names of nurses, and we soon realised was the paucity of information. A trawl for information was made through the database of RCN members. Bulk emails were circulated asking members if they had any family member who had nursed during World War I. A member, Janet Paterson, spotted our request and contacted us as her gran, Lucy Simpson Kelly, was a World War I nurse, and Janet had her war diary, certificates and medals. And Janet's here today with some of her grand's memorabilia. Sean Graffin, nurse lecturer who had researched World War I Belfast trained nurses, got in touch and shared a database of nurses he had gathered, and you'll hear from Sean later. In recognising the contribution of these nurses, one needs to remember that at this time women did not have the vote. Neither would Parliament recognise or protect the title of nurse in law, just as they had protected the title of midwife-in-law in 1903. At this time, nurse training, having been strongly influenced by Florence Nightingale, had developed into a 3-year training programme. Nurses had to be 22 years old before being accepted to train. The hours were long and the pay was poor, so for us not much has changed in 100 years. You can read some of the comments about training on the pull-ups at the back of the room. So when war erupted, many hundreds, if not thousands, of nurses across Ireland who had trained in state infirmaries and voluntary hospitals applied to serve either with the military units, such as the Queen Alexander Imperial Military Nursing Service Reserves, the Territorial Force Nursing Service, or civilian nurses with the Red Cross. The QAs were an elite group of nurses formed following the Boer War. They only accepted nurses who had been trained in 6 Irish hospitals, the Royal being one. Class, ability to speak a second language, and nursing experience were essential criteria. At the outbreak of the war, there were around 300 Queen Alexander nurses, including 34 from Ireland, who were immediately called up. Many nurses applied to the reserves as it had a less demanding entrance criteria. Overall, there is no definitive list of nurses who served, and the only way to get accurate numbers would be to trawl through all the military records at Kew. Therefore, we do not know how many nurses from Ireland enlisted. Dr. Yvonne McEwen, a nurse historian, has carried out extensive research on the nurses' contribution and has been given access to military records. In 2016, she oversaw the unveiling of a plaque dedicated to the memory of British, Irish and Dominion nurses who had died as a result of the war. There are 500 names on that plaque, which is in the National Library in Edinburgh, but it is by no means complete. Along with the trained nurses from here who enlisted, so too did a large number of women who had been trained under the Ulster Volunteer Force or Carson's Army during Home Rule crisis. Many of these worked under the Red Cross as voluntary aid detachment nurses. They also staffed a number of UVF-sponsored hospitals, of which there was one in France. The Somme Nursing Home stands in the grounds of the original house donated by Sir James Craig, where those suffering shell shock were treated. Nurses volunteered for many reasons: to support the war effort and to support the cause of professional recognition. It was also an opportunity to travel and to see the world. Some were from a military family or had a family member who enlisted. And of course the pay was better than that of a civilian hospital. This was a war that was expected to be over by Christmas, and I'm sure the nurses never thought they would be enlisting for 4 years. Our nurses found themselves working on all fronts: France, Egypt, Greece and beyond, and in all quarters, on the front line in casualty clearing stations, on hospital trains, barges and ships. They had to cope with mass casualties from such battles as the Somme and Gallipoli. They were aboard hospital trains which were bombed and ships which were torpedoed or had to navigate through minefields. They went without sleep, worked in extreme temperatures of cold and heat, caring for their patients, soldiers and civilians, blown to pieces, gassed or suffering from psychological trauma. The correspondence between Dr. George Gibson, an RVH doctor who enlisted and was stationed in Salonika, and his sister Madeline, a VAD in the UVF hospital in Belfast, is held at the Somme Museum. In his letters to Madeline, Dr. Gibson describes the hospital base as being 7 miles from access to water. He also describes the arrival of nurses to the hospital as floundering up in the rain and in the mud up to their knees. He advised his sister not to enlist to work abroad. He also shows surprise to meeting up with some of the nurses he had known in the Royal, Sisters Carnahan and Fleming. Reading the narratives of those nurses who documented their experiences, the compassion for the Tommy is evident, with little comment on their own discomfort. It is clear from all accounts that nurses took a pride in caring for the physical and emotional needs of the wounded. Cleanliness and nutrition was important, as was doing dressings and maintaining a sterile area in the theatres. How it was managed I can't imagine, as this was the era before antibiotics, and keeping wounds free from infection would have been quite a skill. The accounts show a real sense of pride when nurses, through regular wound irrigation, could save a limb from being amputated. Molly Best notes they never lost a patient to typhoid. Nurses stayed with the dying, frequently writing to the deceased family. It's also hard to imagine the logistics of managing hundreds, if not thousands, of wounded who required treatment following the big pushes which took place. The early ambulances were horse and cart, and patient transfer was slow. We know that nurses were at risk to all hazards of war, contracting any of the many infectious diseases which often broke out, from measles to malaria and TB. Belfast-born VAD Emma Duffin describes how she got irritated eyes from washing gassed soldiers, as the gas had impregnated the soldiers' uniforms and she was getting the fumes. Mary Ogilvy Simpson from Ballymena contracted malaria and, very much against her will, was discharged home. Nurses died from TB. Mary Louise Morel from Articlave, who trained at Guy's Hospital, was sent to Salonika, where she sadly contracted malaria and then TB. Her military records note that she was a good ward and theatre nurse. She was discharged with TB and sent home, initially to a sanatorium in Trevor. The manager there wrote to the War Office to say she was too ill to be nursed there or anywhere else in Ireland. She died in the care of her family. Hessie Johnson from Voluntary also died of disease in Cairo. Others were killed in combat. Evelyn Dawson, matron on the hospital ship Salta, was drowned and her body washed up on French shores. Nurses also suffered psychological trauma, and we know that one of our own nurses attempted suicide. Many nurses were also mentioned in dispatches for their bravery. Some received military medals. Annie Cahoon, who trained in the Oma Hospital, was awarded the military medal for assisting a fatally wounded colleague and patient when both were injured following attack. Annie also received the French Croix de Guerre and Serbian gold medal. Ethel Devonish Mayers, born in Uri, also received the military medal for performance of duty while exposed to enemy fire and bombs. The amount of information gathered on our local nurses is a reflection of what is known. The Imperial War Museum Lives of the First World War website seeks to build a timeline of service personnel, including nurses, and information and detail is sadly lacking for many of the nurses. For those who survived the war and returned home, we can only assume that, like all war veterans, they spoke very little of their experiences, hence the lack of written documentation and family history. While many returned to nursing and civilian life, others, such as Lucy Kelly, travelled abroad, with some, such as Margaret Anderson, choosing to remain in military service. We don't know who applied for the advertised district nursing post in America, Horse Riding Essential. Managing the huge demobilisation of thousands of nurses must have been a nightmare. The newly formed College of Nursing, later to become the Royal College of Nursing, was supportive to many. We can't underestimate the experience of returning nurses and their contribution to the development of the nursing profession. One such is Annie Musson, matron of the RVH who I spoke about earlier. Born in England, was matron of the Royal until 1946. She saw the hospital through the troubles of the 1920s and World War II Belfast Blitz. She was a strong supporter of nurse education and established one of the first registered schools of nursing in Ireland. Miss Musson was an accomplished artist and frequently exhibited at the Ulster Academy of Arts. In planning this presentation, we thought it was appropriate to recount the history of some of our nurses who were researched and also read from the personal accounts of others to add authenticity to the nurses' experience. So I now hand over to Heather, who met with the family of Rosa MacGibbon.
Morning. Sister Rosa MacGibbon, Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, and affectionately known as Sis to her family, was born in Ulster Street beside the gasworks in Lurgan, County Armagh,
on the 12th of September 1884. One of 6 children, her father David MacGibbon was a plasterer by trade and her mother Mary MacGibbon, née McGreevy, a dressmaker. They attended church at St Peter's, North Street in the town. Roseanne's family were all very talented and shared a love of music. They staged concerts and shows locally. Some of them were involved with the Dandy Players, a well-known theatrical group of that time. The MacGibbon family are recorded in the 1901 census as now residing at 46 North Street, Lurgan. It shows Roseanne's occupation to be a dressmaker, now aged 16 years of age. Roseanne commenced nurse training sometime in the period after this. Writing on a postcard shows Roseanne's name and address as North Street. Faintly written below this, Mater Hospital, Belfast and Dublin. This suggests that she may have had a connection with one or both of the hospitals, perhaps through her nurse training or as a qualified nurse. In her time before joining the Queen Alexandra's, Roseanne worked privately for a local parish priest. Father Paul Campbell was appointed parish priest of Tullylish, Guildford, County Down in January 1898 and died on the 14th of July 1911. Roseanne's name appears on the 1911 census, showing her to be the resident nurse at this Tullylish address. Roseanne enlisted in the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service on the 2nd of June 1915. She sailed from Southampton on His Majesty's Hospital ship Aquitania on the 19th of November 1915, arriving in Suez 10 days later. Roseanne served with the 18th Stationary Hospital and the 21st General Hospital in Egypt. During her time there, she was acknowledged by S. Williams, Matron, Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, 21st General Hospital, in a correspondence to the Matron-in-Chief. This described Roseanne as being kind to patients, methodical and capable, pleasant to work with, and an excellent ward manager. Roseanne met a doctor and romance blossomed. They became engaged and were making plans to marry. She collected items for her bottom drawer. One of these items was a beautiful Egyptian brass table which she came across on her travels. This table was eventually transported back to Lurgan and still takes pride of place in a family member's home. Roseanne also had an interesting hobby, collecting scarab beetle buttons. This was a common collectible of that period. Apparently in ancient Egypt, these buttons were associated with bringing good fortune, having particular powers to ward off evil, provide things for this life and also the next. Because of these beliefs, buttons like these were frequently discovered in ancient Egyptian tombs. In 1918, Roseanne became ill and was diagnosed with appendicitis. Following an appendicectomy, it was noticed that glycosuria was present. Roseanne's health would not allow her to remain in Egypt, so after completing over 3 years of military service, she had to return home for a period of sick leave. Once back in Lurgan, she was nursed by her younger sister Kitty in their North Street family home. During this time, Roseanne's condition began to deteriorate. Complications associated with her diabetes took their toll on her already fragile state of health. And sadly, on the 6th of March 1919, Roseanne, aged 34 years, succumbed to her illness and died peacefully. She is buried in Docker Cemetery, Victoria Street, Lurgan, along with other family members. Roseanne's fiancé wrote to her family after her death, but unfortunately they never got the opportunity to meet him. Finally, Roseanne MacGibbon's name is listed as Rosa on the memorial plaque on the west wall in St Anne's Cathedral, a fitting tribute to a truly remarkable and brave lady, lest we forget.
I'd like to read a personal account from Molly Best. Molly Best was born in Jarrett's Pass, County Down, on the 11th of January 1886. She trained in the Royal Victoria Hospital, Belfast, from May 1909 until January 1913. Leaving there to train as a district nurse in Dublin, Molly applied to join the Queen Alexandria Imperial Military Nursing Service at the outbreak of war, when she was working as a district nurse in Omagh. Molly died in 1960. In the 1950s, she wrote 3 articles for the Nursing Journal of the RVH describing her civilian and military World War I nursing experience, so an extract follows. As radio had not been invented to keep us posted on World War affairs, and I hardly ever looked at a newspaper, the declaration of war on August the 4th, 1914, burst upon me as an enormous surprise. Omagh being the headquarters of the Inniskilling Fusiliers, men in khaki suddenly appeared everywhere about the streets, and detachments constantly marched through the streets, followed by cheering crowds, and headed by the regimental band playing rousing quicksteps. As I had always been attracted by the notion of army nursing, these martial signs and sounds were too much for me. I applied at once to join the QAs, and in a few weeks was instructed to hold myself in readiness. On an October evening in 1915, I, as one of a party of QAs deposited at Bologna, was posted with 2 other Irish sisters to the 14th Stationary Hospital, formerly the Grand Hotel at Wimereux, an imposing edifice on the seafront. Typhoids and paratyphoids were housed in the main building, where isolation cases were accommodated in the compound at its side in huts of various sizes down to bathing cabins. Practically all my time there was spent in nursing typhoid cases, a new experience for me. I do not remember having a single death during my time there. A depressing memory of that period is the steady stream of ambulances that passed our gates day and night for weeks during the Battle of the Somme, bearing wounded men to local hospitals and en route for the hospital ships and England. When I heard that volunteers were wanted for hospital ships, I put down my name for the new experience, although I was quite happy at 14th General. At the end of 1916, I was appointed to HMHS St David. She carried 4 MOs and 4 nursing staff, in addition, of course, orderlies. In a month or so, I got the upper hand of seasickness and was able to stick at my post in any weather for 7 months, until all sisters were taken off hospital ships as the Germans were sinking them wholesale. During that time, I had crossed the Channel more than 120 times and had many occasions to admire the courage, the cheerfulness of terribly wounded men. I can recollect a lad of about 19 or 20 laughing and joking as he was carried down on a stretcher, although when I went to do his dressings, I found that his wounds were appalling. Those also who had been blinded faced their disaster with an incredible display of happy schoolboyishness. The rank-and-file Tommy of 1914 to 1918 was a grand fellow, and I was proud to have the privilege of doing something to help him. Owing to the sinking of hospital ships by the Germans in 1916 to 17, all sisters were taken off, and for 6 months I did duty on ambulance trains running from Southampton to the north and west of Great Britain. Then an agreement was reached with the German government that hospital ships would be respected in the Mediterranean if each carried a neutral officer. Again, volunteers were wanted. During my next 10 months on the Mundilla, we were mostly bringing patients to Avonmouth, but twice we took them to Dublin, and twice we had to transport about 500 Portuguese, nearly all TB cases, from Brest to Lisbon. Twice we carried a load of Australians who had been invalided out of the service to Alexandria for transit by train to Suez, and thence home in their own ship. They were a lively crowd. On our first trip, out of the 500 on board, 120 were minus a leg, and 5 had lost both legs. But that they didn't let such trivialities interfere with their amusements. They went all over the ship, from the engine room to as near the crow's nest as they could get, reporting periodically to us to have their injured stumps dressed. Any spare time they had was devoted to gambling. Games of house were constantly in session. Who can tell what misery lay behind this light-hearted devilry? On each trip, an Australian committed suicide. One stopped while trying to get out through a porthole, cut his throat in the night, though a special guard was beside his bed. Another went quietly over the side of the ship and refused to see the lifebuoy thrown to him. On a later trip, one of our British officers simply disappeared when we were in the middle of the Mediterranean. The only clues were a dressing gown from a cabin and a pair of slippers with their toes pointed towards an open porthole. Molly remained with the Wandilla until the end of the war.
Mary Ogilvy Simpson was born in Ballymena on the 10th of August in 1882. She grew up at West Church Manse in the town. Mary trained at the Adelaide Hospital, Dublin, from 1906 to 1912. She joined the QAs in 1915. She delivered a talk on her wartime experiences many years later. The following is an edited version. My life in nursing and First World War and after 1906 to 1945. I applied to the War Office for overseas service with the Queen Alexandra Nursing Service and was thrilled to the bone when I got a wire from the War Office asking how soon I could be ready to go to Egypt. I'd always felt that nursing was about the only occupation in those days that might give one a chance of travelling and not at one's own expense. On September the 13th, 1915, with 12 other nurses, I embarked on the Gallica, a steamship built by Harland and Wolff. We sailed from Southampton en route to Alexandria. Our trip took 13 days, the ship's number was 13, and there were 13 of us on board. Whether all the 13s had anything to do with it, some 6 weeks later, the Gallica struck a mine while entering Le Havre, and sadly all 19 Royal Army Medical Corps personnel died. The hospital to which I was sent in Alexandria was originally a British Army barracks, a good solid building and well suited for a hospital. Our patients came to us from the Dardanelles and Gallipoli and were generally seriously wounded. Many of them had head injuries and were often difficult to nurse. However, we were fortunate in having a well-known brain surgeon, and most did well. I was often surprised at their progress, as their wounds had been so serious. Here, I got as much surgical work as I could wish for. When at all possible, our patients were sent home on hospital ships, and the delight on their faces when they got this news was wonderful to see. The heat was terrific at times, but we were lucky as the building was a good substantial affair and could be fairly easily ventilated. 2 months later, in February 1916, I found myself once more on the move, this time to Suez, to the 18th Stationary Hospital at the lower end of the canal, and on the edge of the desert which stretched for miles as far as we could see. The hospital was under canvas, all the wards being in tents. Occasionally we had sandstorms blowing. Sand prevailed over everything else. Now and again we had a visit from the Casman, a very hot wind, that had the most disastrous effect on our tempers and made even the mild of us fractious and crabbed until it took itself off again. Most of our patients came from the Sinai Peninsula, suffering from malaria, dysentery and sandfly fever. It was the hottest time of the year, and very trying for the patients, as it was almost impossible to keep the tents cool. We only kept them a few days, as they were then sent by ambulance to Cairo, if they were able for the journey. The hospital in Cairo was in a building and not nearly so hot as in Suez. Theatre work in Suez was more than hot, as the tent used had only a single canvas roof, and when the steriliser was in action and the sun at its height, the work was most exhausting. We dripped from every pore in our body, and worst of all, from the tips of our noses onto the open wound or dressing. It was the work of one person to go around and mop up the drips as they appeared, as with our sterilised hands, we could not do so ourselves. Soon after my spell of night duty in Suez, at the end of 1916, orders came that the hospital would be closed and packed up for transport to Salonika. We set off by train to Alexandria and from there by boat in an Australian liner, transformed into a hospital ship en route to Malta. On our boat, we had one of our own nursing sisters as a patient, and I was one of 3 whose job on the journey was to look after her by day and night, as the poor thing had suffered a mental breakdown and needed constant watching. We got her safely to Malta, where she was taken care of in hospital until it was possible to send her home to Australia on a hospital ship. From Malta, we sailed to Salonika up the Aegean Sea on a very zigzag course, as a hospital ship had been torpedoed just a few days before. Apart from the possible danger, it was a lovely trip in good weather. We arrived in Salonika on New Year's Day 1917. Soon after, I was sent up the line to the 25th Casualty Clearing Station near the village of Guben. This was another hospital under canvas and was always very busy, as convoys of ambulances came in almost every day with patients from the front. A few were wounded, but mostly they had malaria, which was rampant. It was so bad at one time that it looked as if most of our army would have to be sent home unless there was an increase in the number of hospitals. In 1916, 21,902 patients with malaria were evacuated to Malta or England. Mosquitoes were never far away at any time in our camp, and we often found tortoises of all ages and sizes. Now and again we had plagues of ants in our tents, but the insects I disliked most were the centipedes, which could be almost a foot long, were a dull yellow colour and smelt. Several times we had patients in for treatment of septic wounds caused by centipedes. The Great Fire in Salonika took place that August 18th, 1917. A great part of the city was destroyed. From our hospital we could see the smoke rising above the ridge hills between us and the city. 80,000 people were left homeless. Camps were set up and organised by the Allies, and the British gave 1,000 tents which provided shelter for over 7,000 people, many of whom made acquaintance with constant cleanliness for the first time in their lives. By November 2018, I had several attacks of malaria, which was getting worse as time went on, and I finally had to go into hospital for a rest and a course of quinine. While there, I was told that I would be sent back to England as soon as I could travel. With several other crocs, we began our journey home by train, road and sea, eventually reaching Rome and then on to Le Havre. The sister sitting next to me on the train had TB, and she, poor soul, found the journey very tiring. After a good crossing from Le Havre and a quick run to London, I found that she had to get to Wales and had no one to meet her or see her off. We spent the first night in London in a hostel, and I saw her on her train the next day before continuing my journey to Liverpool. Some weeks after, I heard that she died at Christmas, the first Christmas after the armistice. Mary eventually returned to Northern Ireland. She worked as matron of a boys' school in Kilkeel, matron of Ballymena Cottage Hospital, and finally matron of Manor House School in Armagh.
Margaret Rafferty was born the second daughter of Mr. William Rafferty in Water Street, Newry, County Down. Margaret trained as a nurse in the Belfast Union Infirmary, now the Belfast City Hospital. Following the completion of her training, she worked as a charge nurse sister at the Union Infirmary, Belfast, up until the outbreak of World War I, when she was called up for duty with the Queen Alexander Imperial Nursing Reserve. Initially sent to Liverpool in 1915, she departed on a hospital ship and travelled to the Dardanelles in northwestern Turkey, where she acted service treating British and French casualties from the ill-fated assault carried out by the Allied forces on the Dardanelles Straits. Many of the casualties sustained horrific injuries with loss of life as a result of the Turkish mines which had been laid. Following the Dardanelles campaign, Mark was posted to Gallipoli, as where an Allied invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula was taking place involving British and French troops as well as Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. During this campaign, the Allied forces sustained many heavy casualties, and it was decided to begin evacuation in December 1915. In 1916, Margaret embarked on a hospital ship in Egypt and India, where she also seen active service treating many of the casualties from other Allied countries involved in the war. In addition, Margaret Rafferty was mentioned in dispatches and decorated for services in Mesopotamia. Nurse Rafferty proceeded to nurse in a hospital in Basra, now Iraq, where she primarily cared for wounded officers. Back home, Nurse Rafferty was mentioned, adventures were mentioned in an article in the Newry Reporter in 1917 entitled Sister Rafferty Amongst the Gallant Band. Sister Rafferty was demobbed in 1919, and following her return to civilian life, she took up a position in the Belfast Board of Guardians, where she served for nearly 30 years and was much thought of and admired by other members. Margaret died in 1936, and at her funeral, members of the British Legion lined the route of her funeral cortege. Margaret is buried in St Mary's Cemetery in Newry. Her name appears on the Roll of Honour plaque located in the Belfast City Hospital tar block, dedicated to those who served in the First World War.
Lucy St. Nee Kelly was born in Belfast and trained in the Belfast Union Infirmary in 1905 to 1908. She joined the QAs in 1915 and spent a large part of the war in France nursing casualties who were transferred by hospital trains from base hospitals back to French ports for evacuation to England and Ireland. At the end of the war, she returned to Belfast 1919-1920, later travelling to Canada where she married. She worked in Canada before returning to Belfast. Lucy was awarded the ARRC, I think that's the Royal Red Cross badge, by her for her World War I service. She died on the 13th of February 1958, and as you have already heard, we're very pleased that it is her granddaughter here today with the memorabilia of this lady that's very dear to my heart for a lot of reasons. The following are a few of her diary entries, which cover the period from 1915 to 1919. I have looked at them, and they're beautifully written, lovely handwriting, and quite legible. Not many punctuations, but you know what a diary is like. October 18th, 1915, joined the QAs, arrived at Central Military Hospital, Aylesbury. Had a very happy year, was sorry to leave for France on October 9th, stationed at 14th Stationary Hospital, Wimereux. Very good nursing. Had to work very hard, nothing new. Lucy then begins to work on hospital trains. September 8th, 1916, arrived in Boulogne at 9 a.m. Huns were over and dropped bombs. Did not sleep. You can hear the firing from the front line all the time. September 15th, left at 1:30 for Remy. Arrived at 4 p.m. Left at 5 p.m. with 500 patients, mostly all very ill. Had a very busy time. Arrived at Icable at 3:30 a.m. Excuse my French, might be properly pronounced. 20th September, left at 4 p.m. with 500 patients. Not very bad cases. Most of them had been over the top that morning. Went to bed at 12:30 midnight. 23rd of September. Left early on our way to Balloon. At 11:30 a.m. for Rouen, we had a lot of German prisoners. We had to turn a case off at Icable. He was so ill, and we thought he would never reach the destination alive. It was such a trying trip, trying to make the patients comfy. 20th of September. Most beautiful day. We met Captain Stevenson. He told us to hurry up and come to a concert, so we rushed in to put on our mess dresses. The concert was good, only the planes hovering over attracted me more than the performance, in case they would bomb us. and the firing being heavy prevented our hearing very well. When we got home again, we got a warning that the Huns were coming, so we had to get our gas helmets ready. We did not undress in case we'd have to go to the dugout during the night. 28th of September. We left for Cambia, arrived at 10 p.m. Patients all very ill. We had a death on the train. September 29th, most awful night. Had to leave the train and go into a cellar crowded with French women and children, old men and women. Waited until 12 midnight, no bombs. We came back to the train. About a half an hour, bombs commenced to drop all around us. It finished at 2 a.m. What an awful night. Most beautiful day. Not having much sleep last night. I'm feeling awfully sleepy and tired. Left at 9 p.m. Had a dreadful night. Bombs dropping all around the line. Driver killed in the train in front of ours. We were held up for hours as bombing was so fierce, lines had to be put down again. We heard 4 soldiers were killed. October 1st, this is 1918 now. Beautiful day. We met Captain O'Brien, had a good laugh. Then our train was going. We had a rush at 11 a.m. They took us back through Hasbro, where we were bombed. 3 landing within 10 yards of our train. We had a very sad case. A boy of 19 years lost sight of both eyes. October 2nd. We haven't been in bed since early yesterday morning, so naturally I'm very tired. We went to load. What a time. All the way shells were flying over our train and had many narrow escapes while loading. Shells were bursting over our train car, one coming nearer until the last was truly a few yards. We got orders to move out without our full number of patients, and we had fortunately just got out when the lines were blown up. We came straight back from base to continue our loading. Patients being brought in by cars. Just as we were about to finish our loading, bombing commenced. We got some of the casualties, and when operating on them, renewed bombing continued at a time and turned machine guns on the train. Added note, I forgot to say that there had been an awful raid there. Orderlies, sisters and patients killed. We hear that it is worse than it has ever been. We are wondering what we will hear tonight. Had warning. Had to get out of bed and go to the fields. Oh, it was cold. Sunday the 24th of March. Most beautiful day we could hope for. We were all feeling a bit shaky after our previous bombing and shelling, but the day was so bright it made one feel happy to be alive. I took a stool in the corridor to let the sun get at my hair when suddenly a most awful crash and I was flung off. As I tried to rise, I was flung down again. I was quite certain it was bombs. We then found out we'd had a collision and a troop train had run into us. We left 2 coaches behind and continued our journey. We had all slight bruises and were much shaken. We continued our journey. We loaded about 4 a.m. Monday, and it took us until 7 p.m. that night to get to our destination. We had an awful bad road and stretchers everywhere, and patients in every hole and corner. Arrived at Rouen about midnight, 27th of March. Continued our journey. It took us all day to get there, and the sights we saw were shocking. Refugees fleeing away, trains full of them, and also walking along the roads, streams of them, constantly. We got to our destination at 5:30, and oh, what a wreck of a place, and what a railway station with people and luggage. We heard that an awful raid had happened the day before. Aerial torpedoes dropped to kill you. With what we had seen all day and were hearing, we did not feel at all happy. When it was getting dark, we also met lots of wounded coming down in trucks. Oh, what a sight we seemed to have lived through. The boys encouraged us along the way, telling us that our engine was on the wrong end of the train and we were going right straight back to Berlin. And someone else say, there goes the lucky 19. We were really glad to move out. Demobilised on the 31st of March 1919. Arrived home on Friday the 9th of May 1919. Commenced work in Purleyspring Friday the 16th, arriving Thursday the 15th of May to the isolation ward that's in the fever hospital. There are no more entries following the beginning of Lucy's work in Purleyspring Fever Hospital. And I started working in 1950. She left in 48. I started in the Fever Hospital in 1950, and I only missed her 2 years.
At the outbreak of World War I, in July of 1914, the government expected the war to be over by Christmas 1914. No one could have expected the war to go on for 4 years, and certainly no one could have envisaged the high number of casualties that were occurring as a result of the war. In 1914, penicillin was some years away from being widely used to treat infections, and while antiseptic acids were available, they were unreliable in infected wounds and difficult to use in the field when treating casualties. Using sphagnum moss as a wound dressing had been a soldier's trick since ancient times. In June 1916, about 20,000 sphagnum moss dressings had been produced per month, reaching 1 million per month in 1918. Shortages of cotton during World War I, caused in part by its use in the production of ammunition and the tremendous number of casualties, led to a shortage of bandages for wounded soldiers. In its place, the military turned to sphagnum moss. The collection of sphagnum moss appears to have been carried out across the UK and Ireland, wherever there were peat bogs and sphagnum moss was found growing. The work was largely carried out by groups of volunteers. In this illustration, you can see them collecting it and processing it at one of the plants. Charles Walker Cathcart, an Edinburgh surgeon and botanist, organised collection of the moss throughout Scotland, and centres for its cleaning and preparation were established. Most of the collecting was done by women and children, often scouts and girl guides working long hours in cold, wet bogs. Cathcart's marbles soon spread to Ireland and areas of England such as Dartmoor, where sphagnum moss was abundant. Millions of wound dressings containing sphagnum moss were used to treat casualties of World War I 1914 to 1918. Sphagnum moss can absorb up to 20 times its own volume in liquids such as blood, pus, antiseptic solutions, and promotes antisepsis and wound care. Sphagnum moss, therefore, was superior to the pure cellulose dressings, with its raw material was expensive. During World War I, sphagnum moss dressings became invaluable in the management of wounds and the treatment of injured soldiers as a result of the war. But sadly after the war, it was consigned to the alternative medicine cabinet in favour of new wound dressings.
Thanks, John. Well, John was a man with a mission, and he found about sphagnum moss, and he spotted it in Dobbies one day. So he has put together a presentation at the back of the room, which you can see, and the pull-ups that we designed as part of our project that we got the Heritage Lottery funding for is at the back of the room, along with some of the World War books. And the readings and the personal accounts of the nurses are in that. And I'm sure you probably found, like we did when we came across them, that they were very moving just to hear, you know, those nurses that did write down the impact of the war, what it was like. And certainly I don't know that I could have endured the resilience that those nurses at that time did. And I don't think I really appreciated really the history that we had in our profession before we started. I think I could say that for me, doing this project around World War I, I felt it a duty more than a desire, but as we got into it, it really became, I suppose, a project that we all loved to get involved with, and it became very personal to us all. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come and speak to you this morning. It's a little bit of a hard act to follow, actually, after the stories we've heard this morning, which I think really sum up nursing in the First World War. So often it's thought about as a gentle activity that is suitable for women, but actually many of the harrowing things that they went through sort of scarred them for life. It was very heavy, difficult work, which did have often a psychological legacy, I think. But it's always a pleasure for me to speak about the splendid collection that we have at the Imperial War Museum, the Women's Work Collection. It was gathered between 1917 and the very early 1920s. Now, the Imperial War Museum was set up in March 1917, so we've just celebrated our centenary. And it was established partly as a memorial and partly as a place of record of every type of First World War activity. So that inevitably meant that women had to be included in that. And in April 1917, the Women's Work Subcommittee was established. Now in 2018, I think we tend to think about the First World War rather as just a whole, rather than seeing it as it would have been if we'd been living through it at the time. And I just invite you to think about the spring of 1917. It would definitely have seemed as if the war was going to go on forever. Every family would have been impacted, everybody would have lost a loved one, friend, neighbour. Britain is being attacked from the air, this is a first. But government is taking increasing control on everyday life. Conscription comes in, perhaps not in Ireland, but in 1916 for the rest of the country. And rationing is about to start. There are regulations being imposed on you. And women have just gone over to France as part of the army, dressed in a uniform which has been provided by the government. We've been hearing a little bit about the uniforms that nurses were wearing, and these would have been purchased by themselves. They might have had a grant to buy the uniform, but they're not issued by the government in the same way that these members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, their uniforms were issued. That's a really major thing. So the Imperial War Museum, how many of you been there? Just a quick show of hands. Oh, quite a few of you, good, that's excellent. It's located in South London, and the Imperial War Museum moved there in 1936. Prior to that, it had had rather a mobile life in various different buildings. But it moved into this elegant building, which had formerly been the Royal Bethlem Mental Hospital, or Bedlam. You can imagine the field day that the press had with a war museum moving into a former asylum. And it would be really interesting to know what actually went on there during the First World War, because it was still a hospital, and you think about the sort of mental effects of war. I think it would be really interesting to know. But it wasn't included in the Women's Work Subcommittee inquiries, because I think they were primarily looking for work that women had done specifically during the war, not things that were happening anyway. So, for example, VADs are extraordinarily well covered, and that's because that was a new experiment, and they really wanted to record how that had worked. It was a new phenomenon, but there is very little about Queen Alexandra's Royal Naval Nursing Service, for example. And thinking about Belfast as being a dock place, First World War stewardesses, for example, you know, we hear very little about them, and they are almost absent from the Women's Work collection as well. So this is a portrait of Agnes Conway. And there were two main key players, I think, in the Women's Work Subcommittee. She was the Honorary Secretary, and she was also the daughter of the first Director General of the museum. And she had worked with wounded Belgian soldiers when they came back to Britain in 1914. The other key player is Lady Priscilla Norman, who was the chairman, and that was what she called herself. She went on to become the longest serving trustee of the museum, and she and her husband had gone over to France in autumn of 1914 and set up a hospital there. So again, these women have got first-hand experience of women's work. And what they did was they wrote thousands and thousands of letters to women and to organisations that they were aware of, and they were appealing for information. Not everybody replied, and so it's not a comprehensive collection. And some, like Dame Catherine Furse, who headed up the VAD organisation, said in 1917 that they were far too busy doing war work to think about providing information for a museum. Although later on, after the end of the war, she was actually extremely helpful, and she was instrumental, I think, in the large amount of material that the collection has on VADs and on the Women's Royal Naval Service. So by 1918, they've acquired 69 uniforms and lots of badges and other objects. And this is one of my favourite objects. It's a collecting box for the Scottish Women's Hospitals. Now, when the war broke out, women were primarily working in very much a sort of domestic and nurturing role. So nursing is included in that because it's a woman's activity. But they were also involved in charitable organisations and fundraising. And many of the organisations wouldn't really have got very far if they hadn't been able to raise these funds. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware of Dr. Elsie Ingalls, who I think we've got about 1,000 doctors in Britain on the outbreak of war. She studied medicine at Edinburgh University, and she went to the War Office in August 1914 offering her service to see what they could do to help the British Army. And she was told rather patronisingly, "My good lady, go home and sit still." Now, thankfully, she didn't do that, and in fact, in the Women's Work collection, we have the draft of the letters that she wrote to the French, Belgian, and Russian governments offering assistance. And the French government sort of bit her hand off, really, because she was offering to provide a hospital that would go out to France. There was the hospital at the Abbey at Royaumont, which was staffed entirely by women. So we have female anaesthetists, doctors, surgeons, nurses, orderlies. But as well as the work that they're doing, we've also got women at home raising money for this because they are paying for it entirely themselves. And it was a suffrage organisation, I think. We're thinking about the Representation of the People Act. Elsie Ingalls was secretary of an Edinburgh branch of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. You can just make out the initials at the top of the collecting box. They didn't want to shout about this because they wanted to ensure that they brought in as much money from as many different people who may well have had a problem with women having the vote. So they just got on with it very, very quietly. They are suffragists rather than suffragettes. The other thing about working with the French army, of course, is that there is another obvious problem, and that is language. You can't speak to them in your own language, you're communicating in French. Later they go and serve in Serbia and Russia as well, and those languages also have to be factored in. So, I'm going to talk a little bit particularly about two women. I'm sure you will all recognise Edith Campbell, who's probably the most famous woman in the First World War as far as Britain is concerned. But why? Is she remembered as a nurse? Is she remembered as a martyr? Is she remembered as a resistance worker? It's actually rather complex. And I think it sort of reminds us actually that anybody could actually call themselves a nurse. This photograph is taken in the hospital in Belgium where she was working, and what she was actually doing was setting up the first professional nurse training hospital in Belgium. We can see as well, it's always good to have a picture with dogs, and the dog lying on the floor is Jack. Now, Edith was executed by the Germans in 1915, but Jack lived until 1923, when he was stuffed and sent back to the Norwich branch of the Red Cross. And he eventually found his way to the Imperial War Museum. And I just mention him because I'm talking about the Women's Work Subcommittee, what they collected up to the early 1920s, but things are coming in all the time. So there is a fantastic collection relating to women. And Jack is now on display at the Florence Nightingale Museum, where he is for the centenary. So one of the things that the Women's Work Subcommittee did was commissioned a female photographer, Olivides, to go out to the Western Front to take photographs of women's activities. She didn't actually get there until spring 1919, but one of the things that she wanted to do was take a photograph of Edith's grave in Brussels, which is something you don't normally see, I think. And the committee also commissioned William Heatherall to do this painting of Edith's funeral in Westminster Abbey in 1919. It's very much a sort of state funeral, marking her importance, I think. We've had a mention of the Lives of the First World War, which is a website set up in conjunction between the Imperial War Museum and Find My Past, and it's designed to provide an online permanent digital memorial for all those who served in the First World War. And this is the page for Dr. Elsie Ingalls. And there's a lot of material about the Scottish women's hospitals in the collection, including after she died. It was rather tragic actually. She was suffering from cancer and serving in the Scottish Women's Hospitals Unit in Russia. And in the autumn of 1917, there was a revolution going on in Russia, so they had to come home. And following a nightmare voyage from Archangel to Newcastle, she arrived in November 1917 and died shortly after landing in the railway hotel in Newcastle. But they wanted to commemorate her life, and so memorial funds were set up, and in fact the maternity hospital in Edinburgh was called the Elsie Ingalls Hospital until it closed a few years ago. But the other thing that they were trying to do was actually set up a professional training hospital for Serbian women as well in Serbia in her name. So she dies in November 1917, which is very soon after the Women's Work Committee has come into existence, and they acquired many of her possessions as well. So we've got things like her handbag, there's a hypodermic syringe and her Bible and so forth. And this shows a very old-fashioned display case at the museum, I think dating from the 1950s. The other thing that the committee did was that they commissioned models to show women in action in sort of typical scenarios. And I think this was a way of showing a very colourful depiction of what women were doing. And it's the sort of equivalent of modern digital media. And rather sadly, all of these models, and there were about 26 of them, are sort of buried in the IWM stores. It would be wonderful, I think, to get them out and look at them, because a disproportionate number of them actually relate to women in medical activities. This shows Elsie Ingalls in hospital in Serbia. It's not a very big picture, but you can sort of see the sort of grimy conditions they were working in. And this wonderful painting is by Frances Dodd and shows an operation at the military hospital Endell Street in London. So this is another women's only staffed institution. This was run by women who were actually suffragettes, so sort of more extreme, and it's the subject of one of the little documentaries being shown this afternoon, Deeds Not Words, so if you do have time, do please stay to see that. And this is one of my favourite paintings as well, because the committee commissioned these artists. This is by Sir John Lavery, who was a well-known society portrait painter, and the committee actually persuaded him to work for half of his normal fee. And I rather wonder if that's why there are no faces on this picture. It's a beautiful painting. It's actually entitled Le Havre 1919, Nurse Bilham and Sister Courier. And these are two actual women, they exist. One version of this talk I do actually talks about how you can research different branches of nursing service, so you can look at both of their records. And we've heard about the uniforms, and you can see them at the back. I think there's lots you could say about this. I mean, the postures, why one is sitting and one is standing is interesting, I think, thinking about the relations between the VADs and the professional nurses. The VAD is wearing the Red Cross on her apron, which was given once they had passed their first aid certificates. So, I mentioned Olividis, who went out to take photographs. This shows Dame Maud McCarthy, who was the matron-in-chief of the Army Nursing Services on the Western Front. Yes, you wouldn't want to mess with her, I think. And this shows the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. This is another organisation which was set up, I think, in 1907, and the idea behind them was that they were all mounted, so you couldn't actually be a member unless you had your own horse, which I think says something about the social class that these women came from. They drove ambulances during the war. We can see them here cleaning them. And this is another one showing the women's ward on the hospital ship St Andrew. And I think it's interesting. This is taken in 1919, so these women are being evacuated back. It's interesting that they're all wearing their uniforms in bed, I think. Obviously the flu epidemic is raging. Uniforms are key for identifying organisations, and in December 1917, Horace Nichols was commissioned to take photographs of different uniforms, and this shows the Canadian Army Medical Corps uniforms. I think this was widely regarded as being the most glamorous uniform for the nurses. I think it certainly is. We've also got the recruiting posters. This is Joyce Denny's VAD poster. You can see the Red Cross VAD with the Red Cross on her bib. We've got the St John Ambulance VAD wearing their brassard on the left. And then in the centre we have the General Duties VAD, who may have been a cook or involved in administration, which came in 1915. Now, Joyce Denny's, because if you served with the VADs, you could sort of leave at any time, or if you were on a War Office appointment, you would just serve with them for 6 months. She also served with the Women's Royal Naval Service as well. So if you're researching women, they might have done more than one thing if they're not a professional nurse. So we also have lots of documents and paperwork. This shows the Almeric Paget Military Massage Corps uniform and where you could buy it, so you can see exactly what it looks like. And there's also various ephemera. This is the Silver Thimble Fund, where you would donate a piece of silver which could then be used in fundraising to help the Red Cross. Now, they also appealed for photographs of women who had been decorated. This shows Mrs. G.A. Milliken, who was the Honorary Secretary and Lady Superintendent of the Belfast Depot of Ulster Sphagnum Moss Association. So I'm delighted to have had the Sphagnum Moss coming up. And we also have here, this is Mrs. Dara Chichester, and on the back she describes why she was made a dame, and you can see, I'm not going to go into all that, but she's working with the VAD, she's a commandant of one VAD branch, she's also involved in war pensions, SAFA, and also the 14th Royal Irish Rifles Comforts Fund when she had a spare moment. Some women were decorated with the military medal, that came in 1916, and this is Sister Ethel Kate Thompson, who was on board one of these hospital trains when it was in an air raid in November 1917, and virtually all of the 500 patients that she was carrying, or the train was carrying, were thrown out of their cots. Lots of shell shock patients there. It's pitch black, and I think the 3 nurses who were on the train, just 3 nurses, were all awarded military medals for their behaviour and their coolness. Coolness is often a word that you see associated with the women because they're setting up a standard that the men in the army have to live up to. You know, if women are behaving like this, the men should be too. And I think it really makes, I'm aware that I'm coming to the end, so I'm rushing through. That's the description, that's the citation for her Military Medal Award. This is Lily Cope as well, who was awarded the Medal of the Order of the British Empire. And I've included her because she was actually a nurse in a munitions factory. You know, you don't think about munitions, but of course, you know, they're massive, little towns and cities really. They need to have their own medical structure as well. Now finally, I wanted to mention that death was a daily occurrence in the First World War, but there was a particular shock about women dying. In November 1918, there was an exhibition of women's work in Whitechapel Gallery, and this shows the Women's Shrine. And you can see at one end of each end of the photograph, we've got Edith Campbell and Elsie Ingalls. Their bust is there, and then there are photographs of women who have died. The Women's Work Subcommittee was instrumental in providing the names to the York Seven Sisters Memorial. And I just wanted to finish off, sorry. No. Sorry. I'm going backwards now, sorry. And I just wanted to show Ethel Fernley, who was the first military nurse to die on active service. The Commission asked for photographs of women who had died, and they were put in an album rather like this one. And this is, the bottom nurse is Caroline Maud Edwards, who actually died on HMS Natal on the 30th of December 1915. She had, and three sisters had been invited. They were all serving on the hospital ship Drina. They'd been invited to the HMS Natal to watch a film show when she mysteriously exploded, and all who were aboard lost their life at that time. So we've also got other nurses there who died, and I think I'm aware that I've overrun a little. I'm sorry that was so fast. I will be around for the rest of the day, so if anybody's got any questions, you know, please do come and ask me, because I'm always happy to talk about this collection. It's a wonderful collection, which I think is truly a national treasure.
I'm looking at Belfast hospitals and their nurses in the First World War, and this paper attempts to present a brief outline of the nature of the nurses from Belfast hospitals and their involvement during the war. For the purposes of this paper, Belfast hospitals and their nurses include nurses who have fulfilled the following criteria: those women who had trained in the Belfast hospital and continued to work there during the war, or those who had trained in Belfast hospital and volunteered for military nursing service for the duration of the war, and those who trained elsewhere but ended up working in a Belfast hospital during the war. There's a dearth of source material relating to those who continued to work in Belfast hospitals after war was declared. Conversely, there is much more in the way of sources for nurses who joined a military nursing organisation. The main sources for the military nursing organisations are the nurses' service files, which are at the National Archives in Kew under the classification War Office 399. One of the major features of the response to the imminent war was that due to the sheer scale of the conflict, the utilisation of nurses was going to be unparalleled, as it was recognised that a great many nurses would be needed to deal with the consequences of a potentially devastating war. The preparation for caring for casualty was to be a hugely complex undertaking that was unprecedented in both its scale and character. It presented a major challenge for medical and nursing services in Britain, Ireland and abroad. This meant that the recruitment, organisation and mobilisation of thousands of nurses needed to be implemented to an extent never seen before. And the situation was compounded by the speed at which the civilian nurses and volunteers were applying to join in the war effort. Prior to 1914, nursing in the military had been a relatively limited aspect of war. At the onset of the First World War, Britain had three core military nursing organisations, which we've heard of earlier: the Queen Alexander's Imperial Military Nursing Service and its reserve, and then the Territorial Force Nursing Service, which had been created in 1908 as a reserve for trained civilian nurses who could be called upon to serve in hospitals in Britain and Ireland for treating casualties in war. Many trained nurses throughout Britain and Ireland volunteered for duty in the immediate after onset of war. Applications for the military nursing services increased, and many of them within the first weeks after war had been declared. This resulted in confusion surrounding the recruitment of nurses for war duties. As a consequence, the War Office was compelled to issue a warning to hospital nurses in October 1914, stating that no one had any authority to approach hospital nurses or nursing institutions with a view to securing the services of nurses for any of the troops operating in France. If they were so approached, they had to contact the War Office directly, the British Red Cross or the St John Ambulance Association. The response to war in Belfast and the province of Ulster was positive. The mainly Protestant north-east part of the island rallied to the cause despite the fact the British government had tried to impose Home Rule. Many trained nurses throughout the island of Ireland volunteered for military nursing service during the war years. While the majority of these were from a Protestant background, there was also a sizable number of Catholic nurses who volunteered. The service records provide some insight into their motivation for undertaking military nursing. There is little doubt that a great many of them enlisted out of a deeply held patriotic fervour for king and country. And examples from the service records of those trained in Belfast hospitals include their social status. A number of them had fathers who were pillars of the Irish Ulster establishment. Their middle and upper class credentials were evident in the details that they noted in their application forms. One such example was Mary Ellen Eaton, who trained in the Royal Victoria Hospital. She was from Ballymena in County Antrim, the daughter of a Presbyterian clergyman, and part of her education had taken place in England and in a private school in Switzerland. Her older sister Elizabeth, who had trained in Guy's Hospital, also joined the Queen Alexandra's. Another RVH nurse was Mary Gladys Corrine Foley, who was from Dublin and described her father as a gentleman on her application. Others enrolled as means of escaping a tedious way of life and finding adventure and excitement in foreign climes. Many of the nurses trained in the Belfast hospitals had rural backgrounds, their fathers being small farmers. War presented these women with a unique opportunity of seeing the world, with the potential prospect of being posted to Belgium, France, or even further afield to places such as Malta, Egypt, or Mesopotamia. Such a chance to travel was very attractive and glamorous for a woman who had grown up in the remote Irish countryside. Ellen Agnes Boyle, who came from County Roscommon, had trained in the Union Infirmary in Belfast from 1906 to 1909. She enlisted in the Queen Alexandra Imperial Military Nursing Service Reserve in September 1915 at the mature age of 37, and among her postings were hospitals in Basra, Mesopotamia and Bombay. She appears to have been posted with her friend and fellow nurse from the Union Infirmary, Margaret Rafferty, who was 4 years her junior and who came from County Down and who we heard about earlier on. Some of these women saw military nursing as a more desirable option to working in civilian hospitals. This was most notable in terms of pay and promotion. Many actively sought to improve their material status by gaining promotion to sister level or matron during the war. Such opportunities were common due to the continual shortage of nurses. Promotions would greatly increase their professional options in civilian life at the end of the war. And some of those in the military nursing services did not get the chance to work overseas. Instead, they would be deployed to military hospitals within Britain and Ireland to deal with the long-term convalescence of soldiers and sailors wounded in battle. This was often a disappointment to nurses if they had been looking for exotic postings and harboured ambitions of being promoted based on more remarkable experiences in hospitals abroad. As the war developed, nurses on active duty abroad were in many cases able to expand their role. For example, the shortage of doctors in some casualty clearing stations and field hospitals meant that a number of nurses were trained to give anaesthetics during surgical procedures. There are a number of reports of nurses from Belfast hospitals who travelled abroad to care for the wounded. Just 3 weeks after war was declared, nursing staff that had trained in the Royal Victoria Hospital were named in the British Journal of Nursing. As part of the Order of St John of Jerusalem, a party of nurses was dispatched in August 1914 to Brussels under the authority of the St John Ambulance Association. Included among them were the following nurses who were identified as being members of the Catholic Women's League: Miss I. Kelly, Miss Mary P. Kavanagh and Miss Georgina Sims McGugan. Another nurse was listed as Miss I. M. Martin Nicholson, who had also trained in the Royal. The following January, the British Journal of Nursing announced nurses for Serbia. Miss Catherine Ann Caldwell, who trained at the East London Hospital and the Royal Victoria Hospital Belfast, has served in Bulgaria and Montenegro in the Balkan War, is going with Captain Bennett's party, which leaves London on the 15th inst. In Sir Thomas Lipton's yacht for Serbia and Montenegro. Another report notes that of 15 nurses who embarked from Tilbury for Malta on Saturday the 15th of May 1915, 3 had trained in the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, and the 4th had worked as a staff nurse there prior to joining up. At the outbreak of World War I, there were 3 major civilian hospitals in Belfast. And you can see there, what I put up there is a map of Belfast taken about 1890, showing some of the major hospitals at the time. So the 3 major civilian hospitals in Belfast, outbreak of World War I, were the Royal Victoria Hospital, the Belfast Union Infirmary, which later became the Belfast City Hospital, and the Mater Infirmorum Hospital, which had been established by the Sisters of Mercy. There were also a number of smaller specialised hospitals scattered throughout the city. In addition, there was a military hospital within the precincts of Victoria Barracks in the north of the city. The barracks had been expanded in the 1880s, and there was also an organisation called the Belfast Incorporated Nurses' Home, which provided trained nurses to deliver private nursing to those who could afford it. Following the call to help, another institution was established in the city. This was the Ulster Volunteer Force Hospital. And what I plan to do is briefly look at each of these in turn. The Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast was the oldest and most prestigious hospital in the city. It had been founded initially in 1792. Over the 19th century, it grew to become the principal medical establishment within Belfast. In 1903, it moved from its old premises in Frederick Street to a modern purpose-built building on the Grosvenor Road. Formal nurse training at the RVH was introduced in the 1890s. When the news of war reached Belfast, the RVH began to prepare for the potential influx of military casualties. 2 wards were made ready to receive soldiers. A further 54 beds in other unused wards were reserved specifically for casualties. The Board of Management held an emergency meeting on the 11th of August 1914, at which it was decided to offer a total of 100 beds for wounded sailors or soldiers. Half of these would be available immediately and the remainder on 24 hours notice. The hospital had a large number of nursing staff on its books, as well as a constant supply of probationers. In respect of staff in the Royal, there were a number of doctors and nurses who volunteered for military service in 1914. While these were not on the same scale as other hospitals, it was significant for the institution. This had the initial effect on the remaining staff that due to a shortage of personnel, those nurses who were left had to work longer hours. So far, I have been able to identify more than 30 nurses who trained or worked in the Royal Victoria Hospital who enlisted in the military nursing organisations. When wounded soldiers began to arrive in Ireland, it was a major topic of news. The newspapers provided vivid descriptions of their journey from France to Ireland and then their onward progress to the various hospitals in the country. The arrival of the first party in Belfast on the 5th of November 1914 was a dramatic event which entailed the cooperation of a diverse group of organisations, institutions and individuals under the command of the military authority of Victoria Barracks. 60 of the soldiers who were taken to RVH were taken there, while the military hospital in Victoria Barracks received 21 of the casualties. On arrival at the RVH, the patients were divided into serious and less serious cases and were rapidly allocated to the wards prepared for them. Injuries included shrapnel and gunshot wounds. According to the Belfast newsletter, nurses in their neat and attractive uniforms discharged all kinds of duties with cheerful goodwill. Doctors made a superficial examination of the wounds and gave directions as to the treatment of the injuries, which required immediate attention, while little requests were complied with on all sides. It's important to note that one of the duties that the nurses had at this time when the casualties arrived was to distribute cigarettes to them. This was the first time that nurses in Belfast hospitals encountered wounds inflicted in a war setting. Prior to this, the RVH had treated many patients who had been victims of sporadic sectarian violence in the city throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. There had been serious riots in the city in 1857 and 1886 that had resulted in deaths and many casualties who were taken to the Royal Victoria Hospital for treatment. The hospital had also treated numerous gunshot victims over the years. However, it was more used to dealing with victims of accidents, outbreaks of fever and disease associated with poverty. The nursing staff in 1914 had to adjust to caring for a new kind of patient, young men who were now damaged by war. What they had read in the newspapers now became a reality. They were confronted with the reality of the effects of modern warfare. Many of the nurses had family members or sweethearts who were in the forces, and this would have been an influence on their care of the soldiers. A second contingent of wounded men arrived in Belfast on the 18th of February 1915. This consisted of 478 men in total, including 16 officers who had been transported from France on the hospital ship Carisbrooke Castle to Dublin. 19 of the wounded were taken to the UVF hospital for the first time, and 20 of the wounded were ferried to the military hospital at Victoria Barracks. The Mater Infirmorum Hospital took 26 of the casualties. A week later, 10 soldiers who had been sent to Newton Ards Infirmary were transferred to the UVF hospital, bringing their total patients then to 29. An article published in the Belfast newsletter regarding wounded soldiers who arrived in Belfast on Friday the 30th of April 1915. If one overlooks the obvious hyperbole, the commentary nonetheless offers a vivid image of the arrival of casualties to Belfast. Most of these soldiers had been wounded at the Second Battle of Ypres, which had started on the 22nd of April 1915. They had been at Le Havre and had then been sent to Dublin on the hospital ship SS Oxfordshire. The ship had on board 13 officers and 826 men. Of this number, 152 were assigned to Belfast. The wounded soldiers were from a variety of regiments and different countries, including Canada. And the report discusses the dispersal of the casualties to a number of hospitals in the city. This included 53 being sent to the UVF hospital, 22 taken to the Royal Victoria Hospital, and the Mater Infirmorum Hospital received 24. The remainder were accommodated in other institutions in Ulster. In relation to the Royal Victoria Hospital, the article states, quote, of the 22 wounded soldiers admitted to the Royal Victoria Hospital, 20 were stretcher cases. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Dean MD, the superintendent of the hospital, had made excellent arrangements for the reception of the wounded, and his efforts were enthusiastically supported by the house staff and nurses, while 12 stalwart policemen trained in first aid gave valuable assistance in carrying the patients to the wards. The men were bright and cheery and had appeared to thoroughly appreciate the fine accommodation provided for them and the efforts of the staff to do everything possible that would conduce their comfort and convenience. The 20 men who were unable to walk were put to bed without delay, and soon the entire number was supplied with suitable diet having regard to their condition. As one would naturally expect in a hospital, with the skillful staff and unrivalled equipment of the Royal, there was a marked absence of excitement or flurry. The arrangements working out with a degree of smoothness and efficiency that reflected the highest credit on all concerned. Within half an hour of their arrival, the patients were in bed and provided with hot drinks and food. Some of the men had been severely wounded, but a proportion had been treated in the base hospital and supplied with new uniforms. Recently, about 200 men who could not be accepted in the forces owing to minor ailments such as hernia have passed through the institution and been rendered fit for enlistment. In addition to cases of this class at present undergoing treatment and 22 wounded men admitted yesterday, there are some 13 or 14 injured soldiers and sailors in the institution. Colonel Andrew Fullerton, who had spent 3.5 years in the Royal Army Medical Corps on the Western Front, spoke at the RVH annual meeting held on the 27th of March 1919. He paid tribute to the medical and nursing staff of the hospital throughout the duration of the war. He went on to say that, quote, the nurses of the Royal Victoria Hospital were in the hospital's clearing stations on trains and ships, and they had done magnificent work. And Miss Bostock, the matron, and the hospital had good reason to be proud of them. He also reported that in one clearing station during the early part of the final push last year, I came across 3 of their nurses, all in responsible positions and all very favourably reported on. From August 1914 until the end of 1918, 1,209 soldiers and 171 sailors had been cared for in the Royal Victoria Hospital. Of these casualties, only 3 soldiers died as a result of their wounds. In addition, 6 of the sailors died, all of whom had been shipwrecked and had subsequently contracted pneumonia. Belfast Union Infirmary then, which has now become Belfast City Hospital, and we'll look at that next. It was established in 1875 as part of the Belfast Workhouse Complex. In 1903, further wings were added to the building to provide more wards. Nurse training in the Union Infirmary was formally introduced in 1888. One of the first nurses associated with the Union Infirmary who was called up for service was Miss Woods, the lady superintendent of the Abbey Sanatorium in August 1914. This was part of the workhouse that had been established just outside Belfast at White Abbey in 1904 to care for patients suffering from tuberculosis. In the weekly meeting of the Belfast Board of Guardians on the 13th of October 1914, it was minuted that several officers of the Union Workhouse had volunteered for service, including a charge nurse. Because of the shortage of trained nurses throughout, brought about by enlistment into the military services for the Belfast Union, they had advertised in the local newspapers for 15 probationer nurses aged between 21 and 33 years of age to take up training. They had to repeat the advert again several times as the number of people that applied was very small. By January 1916, it was reported by the Board of Guardians that there were no fewer than 120 nurses who had trained at the Union Infirmary on active service in the various theatres of war. In November 1914, the Belfast Board of Guardians received a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Daly, Royal Army Medical Corps Assistant Director of Medical Services in the Belfast District. He was inquiring about the possibility of obtaining hospital accommodation for sick and wounded soldiers from the ranks of the Ulster Division within the wards of the Union Hospital. This would be an interim measure pending arrangements being made for a permanent hospital to accommodate them. He requested information as to the daily rates of charges per patient in respect of board, residence, nursing, medicine, dressings and medical attendance. The board had responded that 50 beds would be available for urgent cases. Within a fortnight, the Board of Guardians reported that Lieutenant Colonel Grigg had obtained approval to pay the board 2 shillings and 6pence daily per soldier for the Ulster Division admitted to the hospital, which had been established at Corey's buildings. The Guardians agreed to this and to make arrangements with the medical staff for the treatment of the sick and also pay for the expenses incurred by any structural alterations. The Belfast Union created a specific military hospital for six soldiers within its grounds, and this was inspected in December 1914 by its work committee and was deemed to be very suitable with cheery wards. By the end of 1914, the military had taken over the building. In January 1918, the Belfast Board of Guardians received a letter from the War Pensions Committee that since another site, the Corey Care building, would soon be vacant, the committee wished to secure it for the purpose of a hospital for discharged soldiers. To date, over 30 nurses have been identified who trained at the Union Infirmary and who enlisted in military nursing organisations. Okay. Among the other institutions was the Belfast Incorporated Nurses' Home, which actually was not an institution, was an institution that had been used for training nurses throughout the end of the 19th century. And it had quite a number of nurses on its books who were joined up to military service. I'm going to run through then the remainder of the institutions. The Victoria Barracks Military Hospital in Belfast had its own hospital there, which was not a training hospital, and the matron there was a Miss Mary Ann Flynn, who was a Catholic from County Cavan, and she had trained in the London Hospital in Whitechapel. And she had associations with quite a number of other people within the institution and from various hospitals in Dublin as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut through one of the key bits then at the end, which is in relation to one particular individual, which sums up basically a lot in relation to nurses in the First World War. And this relates to a lady called Victoria Beatrice Violet Jolly. And she had trained in the Royal Victoria Hospital and had enlisted in the military nursing organisation. She had been born in Liverpool in 1887. She was a member of the Church of England, and her father Andrew, who had come from Dublin, was a respected physician and surgeon in Liverpool. He had died from an overdose of laudanum while visiting his brother in Dublin in 1897 when Violet was just 10 years old. Violet took up training in the Royal Victoria Hospital from September 1910 till January 1914. She left the hospital after her training and was living in a very fashionable dress in Belfast with her guardian, Sir Robert Anderson, Baronet, who was the first part of Anderson and Colley. During this time, Violet does not appear to have worked in the nursing capacity until she joined the Queen Alexandra's in November 1914, aged 27. For the next 4 years, she was deployed to several military hospitals in Ireland and England. She was stationed at Victoria Barracks, Cork, in January 1915. In March 1916, she was transferred to the Queen Mary's Military Hospital, Whalley, in Lancashire, near where she had grown up. The following month, she was promoted to the rank of sister. She remained at Whalley until October 1917, and then she was sent to No. 1 War Hospital in Birmingham, where she remained until March 1919, when she was transferred to No. 1 War Hospital in Reading. She was awarded the Royal Red Cross. She was demobilised in April 1919, and she was obviously a very good nurse and, according to reports, an excellent ward manager, whose conduct was very good, and this is borne out by her promotion to sister. However, she did have several episodes of sickness. Following demobilisation, she was appointed matron of the Belfast Municipal Children's Hospital. She went on to open a nursing home and hostel, the Hopefield Nurses Hospital, which was still operating in 1930. When war was declared in 1939, she volunteered for the Queen Alexandra Military Nursing Service Reserve and was posted to the military hospital in Holywood, County Down in September 1939 with the rank of sister. However, in February 1940, she was diagnosed with effort syndrome, a condition usually associated with anxiety, and subsequently she was found to be unfit for duty and her appointment was terminated. She died at home on Stranmillis Road on the 22nd of February 1955, aged 68 years. One of the things is a poignant letter has been preserved in her military nursing service records, and I just want to share that with you because it says a lot. She had spent most of her time, all of her time nursing within Britain and Ireland during the First World War, and she had applied to see if she could transfer to the continent or be posted abroad, and unfortunately she was told she was on a waiting list. However, she sent this letter much against military protocol to the matron-in-chief of the Queen Alexandra's on the 1st of October 1918, and she has written, "Dear Madam, may I beg your forgiveness for writing this directly to you, but I think that you will understand when I explain that this is about a purely private and personal matter, and that is why I have waited until I came on leave to write to you. A short time ago I received news that my fiancé had been killed, but nobody at the hospital knew, and I do not wish it known. There are things that one cannot bear discussed. They are too sacred. But now there is nothing left for me to live for. My parents, my brothers, and now Jack, all gone. So I wonder if you could give me something to do on a hospital ship, and if there is a ship going to Russia, if you would allow me to join it. I might go in place of some sister who would have parents to mourn her loss if anything happened to her, while my decease affect no person, and I am only too anxious to give my life for my country if need be. I am spending my leave at my guardian's home and return to duty on the 15th inst at the 1st Birmingham War Hospital. The monotony of my 4 years home service has been broken by periodical leaves from France. But now that is all over, and I long to do something worthwhile, something he would have been proud of. There are only 2 before me on the foreign service list, and as none have left our hospital since March, I hope my turn will come soon. Again asking your pardon for the seeming breach of discipline, I remain your obedient servant, Violet Jolly." The war ended the following month and she didn't get abroad. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank PRONI very much for the opportunity today to speak about Dr. Elizabeth Gould Bell. She is my great aunt by marriage. I propose to tell you about her background and how her life evolved And then I will speak a little bit about women doctors in the First World War and her service in St Andrew's Hospital in Malta. She joined the RAMC and she served there in 1916. She was the first woman to qualify in medicine and practice in Ulster. That was in 1893. She became a general practitioner and a suffragist. This is the only photograph I have of her. Unfortunately, she died in 1934, so I never knew her. But a writer about women doctors said that she had a striking personality and intellect. Growing up, I did know about her, and my late father would have talked about her as a doctor, but I didn't know about her other activities until I heard from the Ulster History Circle that they were planning a blue plaque. This was unveiled in 2016. And my brother Cullen and I were the identified relatives on that occasion. It meant that I suddenly had to turn my attention to family history and also learn some history about the beginning of the 20th century, things that had been rather outside my sphere of interest up until then. This plaque is placed at the entrance of Daisy Hill Hospital, which is built on the site of the old Newry workhouse and is close to where Dr. Elizabeth Bell was born. Just to outline the family tree of the Bell family, Joseph Bell was clerk of the Newry Poor Law Union and superintendent of the Newry workhouse. Now, Elizabeth's sister Margaret became a doctor also and worked in Manchester. Looking at census records, I believe Joseph and William, her brothers, were assistant clerks in the Newry Poor Law Union. Now, Elizabeth married Hugh Fisher, who was my great uncle, and they had one son, Hugh Bell Fisher, who was known as Hugo. Now, the Fisher family, Dr. Hugh Fisher, was one of 9 children, and his eldest sister, Mary, was my grandmother. Her eldest son, Dr. Martin Ray, was my father, and he was a doctor and with the RAMC and was in the Second World War. At the bottom there you see myself and my 3 brothers. Dr. Bell was born on the 24th of December 1862 at Springhill House, Newry, and I've not been able to find out where she went to school. Education in those days was seen by women as the only way to lift themselves out of domestic drudgery and to better themselves and to have some influence on affairs and the male-dominated institutions. In 1882, the arts faculty of Queen's College became open to women, and in 1888, Elizabeth Bell and her sister Margaret enrolled in the arts faculty. Now, in 1889, women were admitted for the first time to the medical faculty after a very long-running campaign of something like 20 years. And they, Elizabeth and Margaret Bell and Henrietta Rose Neal and 2 others enrolled in 1889. Elizabeth graduated from Queen's College, the Royal University of Ireland, in 1893 in medicine. Her sister actually graduated the following year. And this is her certificate, as you can see, is from the Royal University of Ireland. Now, my great uncle was born in 1870, so he was 8 years younger than Elizabeth Bell. He qualified the same year and became a general practitioner and worked from Great Victoria Street in Belfast. They married in 1896, and very tragically he died in 1901 of typhoid fever in Belfast. Dr. Bell worked in various medical establishments, mainly looking after women and children. She was honorary physician to the Women's Maternity Home, to Malone Place Hospital, and she was medical officer to Riddle Hall, which, as you know, was the residence for female students and staff at Queen's University until quite recently. She worked with the Babies Club's welfare scheme, supported the Women's Christian Temperance Association, and she was a doctor to the women of the suffrage movement who were admitted into Crumlin Road Jail. I think there weren't very many, but she was a doctor to them, and I think a few of them went on hunger strike. Dr. Elizabeth Bell was a strong supporter of the suffrage movement. She joined the Irish Women's Suffrage Society. And what is interesting is she was friendly with Emmeline Pankhurst, a famous suffragette, who was rather more militant than the suffrage supporters. Emmeline Pankhurst invited Dr. Elizabeth Bell and Margaret Robinson to take part in protests in London in November 1911. And it's reported that they smashed the windows of Swan and Edgar department store and probably other shops on the 21st of November. But the journal, which is called Votes for Women, has documented that she was arrested by police in Parliament Square, and she had in her pockets 12 half-pound weights and a hammer. She overheard two police constables discussing how they would declare that she was caught with stones in her hands, and the police had stones in the police station. But in actual fact, the magistrate charged her with obstructing the police, trying to force her way through the police cordon. And she was fined either 40 shillings or 14 days imprisonment. But she chose the imprisonment, as suffrage supporters did in those days, to highlight their cause. And she went to the women's prison in Holloway. And I presume it was for 14 days. For that, she received a suffragette certificate signed by Emmeline Pankhurst and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence. Very beautiful certificate. Just a couple of images of a suffragette meeting. This is Emmeline Pankhurst and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, and Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst being arrested. Now their son, Hugo, was born in 1898 and attended Newry Intermediate School and the Royal Belfast Academical Institution. He enrolled as a medical student in Queen's University in 1914. And I think probably on a compulsory basis he joined the army and was in the 7th Battalion of the Royal Munster Fusiliers. That was in 1915. I just have a couple of pictures. Handsome young chap in his uniform. His service is documented on a Estonian website, and I have details courtesy of Alan Curra. It's known that he fought in the Battle of Passchendaele. This was fought between July and November in 1917, and was the Third Battle of Ypres, or known as the Battle of Mud. On the final day, the 10th of November, he was reported to be missing, wounded, and had been taken prisoner. And very tragically, he died, I believe, of his wounds on the 23rd of November in a German field hospital in Beveren, and he's buried in the Harleybeek New British Cemetery. Just to orientate you as to the Battle of Passchendaele, it took place in Belgium. It was a very controversial battle with a huge human cost. It was fought over a 3-month period in terrible conditions. It was trench warfare, and it's a flooded plain, and there was unusually very wet weather. And as I say, there was a large number of casualties, both on the Allied side and on the German side. When I came to look at medical services during the First World War, I came across this book which gives a very comprehensive account of medical services during the First World War. It's based on official documents and it's by Major General Macpherson. In chapter 13 is concentrated on Malta. There are two other references which are very well worth reading by Leah Lenneman, Medical Women at War and Medical Women in the First World War, ranking nowhere. As medical personnel were advised not to keep diaries, I believe there are very few first-hand accounts of their experiences, and I certainly have no first-hand accounts. In 1914, the War Office would not entertain the idea of medical women serving in a military hospital. I understand they didn't like to think of them being anywhere near the front of war, and so some women doctors offered their services actually to other countries, as we've heard. And I was going to mention two particular women, one of whom has already been mentioned, but Dr. Louisa Garrett Anderson, also a suffragist, formed the Women's Hospital Corps, and she was taken on by the French Red Cross and set up a hospital in Hotel Claridge in Paris. And later, when War Office representatives visited, they were so impressed that they invited her back to London to take charge of a hospital there with her colleagues. In Scotland, we've heard about Dr. Elsie Inglis, who formed the Scottish Women's Hospital for Foreign Service. And they went to France and Serbia. And also some women doctors went out on their own, actually, entirely independently, and offered their services in places like Belgium, Salonika and Sinai. Eventually the War Office, because of an acute shortage of doctors, decided to recruit women doctors. And they were able to, because all doctors have to register and their names are on the General Medical Register, it was easy enough to contact them and ask for volunteers. Now, another very good paper by Jenny and Geddes says that there were about 1,000 women on the General Medical Register in the UK in 1914, and 300 volunteered for service, and somewhere around 129 were employed by the Royal Army Medical Corps during the war at some stage. Now, Dr. Elizabeth Bell's record is on the RAMC website, and she responded to the call to volunteer, and she joined the Women's Medical Unit of the Royal Army Medical Corps in July 1916. The 2nd of August she embarked for Malta with 21 others, and she went to St Andrew's Hospital. She served there for 1 year and returned again in 1917. Just to orientate you then, the fighting was in Gallipoli and Salonika, which is in red there, and you can see Malta on the lower left-hand corner. The distance between Gallipoli and Malta is about 850 miles, quite a considerable journey, and probably took over a week for the hospital ships to reach Malta. Malta had been a peacetime garrison and had originally 4 military hospitals, but they increased that number to 27. And the beds at the height was about 25,000, and a staggering number of wounded from Gallipoli and Salonika were treated in these Malta hospitals. Overall, there were probably 334 medical officers, 76 of them were lady doctors, as they were called, 913 nurses, and over 2,000 other ranks. The first phase was the wounded soldiers from Gallipoli, but many of them were suffering also from the infectious diseases, as we've heard. And the second phase came from Salonika. Again, we've heard they're mainly suffering from malaria. Now, Malta ceased to take soldiers from September 17 due to the submarine attacks on the hospital ships. St Andrew's Hospital had originally been St Andrew's Barracks, and over, I think, about a 2-month period, it transformed from the barracks into a hospital. We now take many years to establish a hospital. It was handed to the Royal Army Medical Corps on the 6th of May, and 3 days later opened with 845 beds. And the maximum beds went up to over 1,700, and I think many of those were in tents. Not only did they obviously treat injuries and diseases, but they did make some effort to rehabilitate soldiers, and there was very, very good pastoral care as well. In addition to the hospitals, they had tea rooms and recreation halls to provide some diversion and socialisation. And the citizens of Malta were extremely good in volunteering to help the soldiers. And lady volunteers met each hospital ship, welcomed the soldier, and provided them with refreshment and a welcome pack. And you can see tobacco there as well. Now the doctors, the lady doctors, they were known as lady doctors, they did the same job as their male counterparts, but they were classed as civilian surgeons. They received the same pay, which was 24 shillings a day, and rations as their male counterparts, but they didn't have military rank. They had no uniform or badges. They were on one-year contracts, so they never achieved any seniority, and they travelled as soldiers' wives rather than officers. Now they proved to be highly competent and resourceful, and in general they were highly acclaimed abroad, but probably less so at home. And when doctors came back to, the lady doctors came back to the UK, they slipped back into less prestigious jobs again in medicine, and that their war service didn't seem to advance their careers. In the RAMC, the women did receive a uniform in 1918, but it took another war for medical women doctors to obtain commissions in the British Army. The question of whether the work of women in general during the war was where they stepped into men's shoes influenced the passing of the Representation of the People Act in 1918 is debated. Finally, Dr. Elizabeth Bell died aged 71 in 1934 at her home in Fall College Gardens, Belfast. She was a leading female member of the medical profession in Ulster. Becoming a doctor was a challenge in itself. And I wonder whether she was inspired to become a doctor by the destitute of the Newry workhouse where her father worked. She suffered immense tragedy during her life with the loss of her husband and daughter, and she devoted her working life to the service of others. 100 years on, women are prominent in all branches of medicine, here and elsewhere, and owe their success to Dr. Elizabeth Bell and others who were the early pioneers. Like many other women doctors at that time, she took risks supporting the suffrage movement. And finally, she served her country well as a doctor in the First World War. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come up here today. Early start, but certainly it's been well worth it from what I've heard so far. Now I'm going to develop a topic that was touched on earlier, which is the spinal moss, which I'm still trying to figure out the right way of pronouncing it. However,
In the summer of 1914, the major political concern about London and Dublin was the possibility of a civil war in Ireland. The assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo was almost unnoticed. However, by early August 1914, the Irish problem had receded into the background when Germany's invasion of Belgium brought Britain and Ireland into what became a global war. Immediately, military reservists were recalled to the regiments, and by the end of the first week in August, the first soldiers of the BEF, British Expeditionary Force, were en route to France. While the military mobilised, the civilian population also organised themselves. In Ireland, numbers of new organisations were established to support the war effort. The indefatigable Lady Aberdeen convened a meeting in the RDS in August 1914, to which representatives of all voluntary groups of any sort of political colour were invited. The result of it was to set up a joint committee to coordinate the work of all these groups. The Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction set up nursing courses for first aid. Sorry, is that better? I think I'm going to stand on my tippy toes. Auxiliary, yeah, that's grand. Auxiliary military hospitals were established, often in private houses. Our Lady Aberdeen converted the state apartments in Dublin Castle to become a military hospital. The British Red Cross and St John's Ambulance Brigade in Ireland coordinated their efforts, and just to emphasise, there were more sections of the St John's Ambulance in Ireland at the time. They coordinated their efforts. They set up a joint headquarters in Dawson Street in Dublin and an Irish War Hospital, big very long titles, supply depot in Merrion Square. The depot supplied vital hospital equipment. Male volunteers made splints, crutches, bed rests, and the 6,000 over the years female volunteers, mainly clerical workers and shop assistants, spent their evenings making dressings, bandages, and coordinating the supply of home comforts which arrived from working parties throughout Ireland and were dispatched to the front. On the direction of this joint committee, numerous voluntary aid detachments, VADs, were established. These were linked either to the British Red Cross or the St John's Ambulance, required to have first aid training which enabled them to supply support services and perform all sorts of duties which the regular military services did not have the resources for in time of war. In the Royal College of Science for Ireland in Dublin, this was the College of Science, first opened in 1911 as a science college. You recognise it more today as the place where the Taoiseach comes out to tell us all the latest plans for our country, for Ireland, or when there's economic disasters or an important visitor. It's government buildings now. There were two VADs established. I'm going to use VAD as a general term, I'm sorry, rather than always going through the words. One for men and one for women. And the majority of the members were either members of the college staff, their families, or former students. The men's detachment worked with munitions experiments conducted in the college, very peaceful. Met the hospital ships bringing wounded from the Western Front to hospitals in Dublin. The women's VAD, to their huge disgust, were told their services were not required to work with the war wounded, and their contribution should be to work in the hospital supply depot or to fundraise. It's worthwhile though noting that quite significant numbers of both of the college VADs volunteered for active service. The women's detachment in particular were very proud of their volunteers. And you can see that they're the volunteers for the year 1917-1918, and one of the reasons I'm showing you is the majority would have been middle class, one or two upper class, variety of religions, one at least had none, Catholics, Methodists, Church of Ireland and so on. So we went right across the board. Some of these women served in France or England for a year, but at least 3 served for the duration of the war, finishing up in 1919. However, a new opportunity for the ladies to make a contribution to the war effort came in 1915. This was sphagnum moss, and as we've heard already, by the end of 1914, cotton wool, the standard component of surgical dressings, had become both scarce and expensive. Where it was available, its use for military purposes was a priority, and the unexpected need for an immense supply of surgical dressings after the early battles in Belgium and France made it necessary to identify and experiment with alternative materials. Various options, such as wood shavings, were explored, but one naturally available one, and which had been used for centuries as a folk remedy, sphagnum moss, became the preferred option. This is sphagnum moss, found in the bogs, seacoasts, moors and inland regions near water. As we've heard already, its political composition gave it a water holding capacity 20 times its dry weight. Dried and treated, it was 4 times as absorbent as cotton wool, could be left on wounds much longer and stay comparatively dry. It was also mildly antiseptic by nature. The bogs of Ireland, with sphagnum at the base, covered 1/7 of the island's surface at the time. The development of the sphagnum dressings in Britain began, as we've heard, under Charles Cathcart, and the ladies in the VAD in the College of Science, as I say, a lot of whom had scientific backgrounds, were extremely interested. They did send across people to talk to Cathcart to see what would be involved. They then opened negotiations with the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction to get accommodation in the college. And they were very successful. So by November, the College of Science became the depot for sphagnum moss in Ireland, and it included a depot in Belfast, which from November 1915 to July 1916 was linked to the Dublin depot, but subsequently was incorporated in the Ulster Sphagnum Moss Association. And these are the ladies, not going through them. The majority of them, as I say, were family or were scientists themselves. The lady in the centre at the front was Miss Reid. She was the nurse. You were required to have a qualified nurse as part of your VAD detachment. And the gentleman at the back, second from the left, is second from the right, is Dr. Winters, who was the doctor for Stephen's Hospital. It was also required to have a medical man attached to your detachment, at least it was in Dublin. Rooms were allocated in the college for the work of the sphagnum department by kind agreement with Daddy and also with the agreement of the professors in the college, and the organisation and collection of sphagnum moss for medical purposes began. The first step was the organisation of the correct moss, because there's lots of mosses in the bogs. The committee wrote to newspapers and approached private individuals and local organisations appealing for volunteers for what they termed essential war work. A band of moss collectors was organised from almost every county in the south and west, and several in the north and east of Ireland, and the College of Science provided them with instructions about collecting and handling the moss. I don't know whether you can see that, but it emphasises cleanliness at all costs. It's one of the 2-page instructions for moss collectors. The work of collection was hard, as those who participated testified. One collector writing, "No one who has not collected moss on a bog can realise how arduous is this part of the work. Even under ideal summer conditions, the moss can only be reached over wet, boggy ground, and when to this is added continuous rain and cold in autumn and winter, which involves waiting to obtain it, it can be imagined that the collector's task is not an easy one." Nevertheless, there was no lack of helpers. Schools, children, Girl Guides, VAD detachments, local groups, parish groups all participated, and during the First World War almost 1 million tonnes of sphagnum were gathered from the bogs around Ireland. When collected, the moss was brought to the local centre, and at one stage there was about 200 moss collecting centres and up to 50 sub-depots reporting to the college. And then it was clean, sorted and dispatched to Dublin. Now there's 2 pictures here. The one on the left is the collecting centres, and you can see they're dotted all over the country. Majority in the Leinster, Munster and Connaught. and the one on the right is the depots. The moss went from the centres to the depots. It was dried and allegedly sorted and packed into bales. The committee of the college centre negotiated free or reduced charges with the Irish railway companies for the transportation of the sacks of dried moss to Dublin. For the various railway termini in Dublin, lorries and carts were provided free by Dublin businesses to bring the bales of dried and processed moss to the College of Science building. At the central sphagnum moss depot itself, the work of processing the bundles of moss received from all over Ireland were dealt with by various departments. A certain proportion of the moss was picked over again by the workers and committee there and was graded, and was divided into 3 different grades. The first grade was the thicker, more absorbent varieties used entirely for surgical pads. The second grade, thinner, less absorbent types, were used for dysentery pads. And the third grade, because nothing was wasted, and the inferior moss was used for filling rest cushions of all sizes. And this is the moss picking room at the College of Science. These are all College of Science lecture buildings. You can see in the background all the sacks of dried moss waiting to be picked over by the workers. After being picked over, a task which was likened by some of the workers to the convict occupation of picking oakum, surgical dressings consisting of muslin bags filled with moss were manufactured. The size and fullness of the bags were carefully standardised in accordance with the specified requirements of the surgeons who would use them. They did send in the requirements. Similarly, a certain amount of the moss was sterilised because some hospitals wanted it that way and some would prefer to sterilise on site themselves. That's the moss picking room. You can see how happy they're all working away. This is making the moss dressings. Again, you can see it was originally a lab in the College of Science. Just sewing and putting them all together. And then there were other departments also functioning in the college. This was the needlework department of the college. Again, you can see that had clearly been a science lab at one stage. So apart from the work of sorting and grading the moss and manufacturing the various bandages, pads and cushions, the depot also had this needlework department, which specialised in limb, stump and abdominal bandages and splints. These needed to be of very high quality, as the life of the average bandage averaged 18 months, nothing disposable back in the First World War, of very hard wear and tear. Now, the sphagnum moss couldn't go anywhere by itself, so they had to be packed. And this is where, sorry. I think something skipped somewhere along the way. Carry on. Nearly finished anyway. So the men's VAD in the college took charge of the supply of cases in which to pack these things and dispatch them. They got donations of raw timber from businesses, and landowners cut down trees and sent them into the museum, where the college carpenter cut them into planks to turn into boxes. Fundraising later was done to pay for the wood purchased if that was necessary. When wood became very expensive, which it did in 1917, 1918, and extremely scarce, the men's VAD collected old cases, some of which were donated by Dublin businesses and refurbished them. Now, every institution needs tea or coffee. So supporting all the work in the College of Science was the tea department, which was opened simultaneously with the depot for the comfort of workers, and where tea, bread and butter was provided at threepence a person, and the profits, which averaged about £3 a month, were paid into the funds of the depot. In early 1916, the War Office officially recognised the sphagnum moss dressings and doubled its requisition of the number of dressings it required each month, and the demands on the workers at the depot increased significantly. War came to Dublin in 1916 with armed conflict. and members of the College of Science VADs, both of them, had personal experience of injury and death. Conditions in those weeks were extremely daunting. The Irish War Supply Depot in Merrion Square was converted to an emergency hospital with Ella Webb as medical officer, and the medical officer of the Spine Depot, William Winter, working there as a doctor. Members of the Women's VAD from the college served there as nurses, while members of the Men's VAD at the College of Science worked as stretcher bearers with ambulances during the week and later as some detail to help bury the dead. The college building itself was closed and not reopened until May. However, some members of the Women's Sphagnum Committee, realising the need for these dressings at the Dublin hospitals, obtained the master key to the building, collected sphagnum dressings and pads, delivered them to the emergency hospital in Merrion Square, sometimes under gunfire, and continued through the week to deliver surgical dressings to hospitals around Dublin, Merrion Square, Baggot Street, which took in a huge number of injured, Patrick Dunn's Mercies and the Dublin Castle Hospital. And quite often they could only get through the army barricades because even though they were told not to, they insisted on wearing their uniforms. After the rising was over, several members of the men's VAD at the college received awards for, I quote, meritorious service, but none of the women. So things don't change too much then. The depot itself reopened in May, and from then on the demand of dressings increased, and not surprising with some starting off in June. The output of surgical dressings in January 1916 from the depot was 1,300 a month. By September it increased to 32,000. At the same time, the college would establish links with Canada, where there were interest in setting up spine and moss depots there. Professor Porter in Canada started inquiring about it because there were peat mosses all over Canada. They collect samples of the moss, sent it over to the College of Science to see whether the right kinds of moss, and they got instruction there how to treat it. So by 1917, there were sphagnum moss, starting with the Dublin initiative, the sphagnum moss depots in Montreal, Toronto, Halifax, and in St. John. And in 1917, after America entered the war, they developed an interest in sphagnum moss, and they, like Chinese whispers, they went to Canada to learn the same. So the expertise and knowledge that had been gained in Dublin transferred through Canada to the States. However, by 1917, the political climate in Ireland had changed dramatically. Elsie Henry, who was the quartermaster, had personal knowledge of this when she visited a sub-depot in Kerry, saying collections have become difficult. This was in Kilgarvan. The Kilgarvan people have boycotted the workers, who's the collectors, and also at first tried to prevent the collection of moss. They attacked the moss gatherers one day, men and women. This is a strange and active bitterness, and the feeling is very anti-English. Nevertheless, the work continued through 1917 and 1918 despite increasing difficulties. The ranks of voluntary workers were necessarily depleted by the needs of the army services. Prices of all materials rose, the collection of funds became harder, and in the case of moss collectors, travel to and from a distant bog became an even greater problem. Yet the depot continued and flourished. Between 1950, when it was set up, and 1918, the collection centres scattered around the country had supplied over 900 boxes of moss to be processed into surgical dressings there. By the end of 1918, the depot had recorded a total output of over 900,000 surgical dressings, moss dressings, dysentery pads and rest cushions. These boxes of dressings and bandages were dispatched to hospitals in various theatres of war. They were sent to military hospitals in America, England, France, Belgium, Alexandria, Salonika and India. I don't know whether you can see this, but this is a list for 1 year's annual reports of the hospitals in which these were sent. Funding. These women of the Women's VAD in the College of Science had very little business experience, but within months of the centre being established, they themselves had established an almost countrywide network for collecting, grading and processing the sphagnum moss. They set up transport links from remote parts of Ireland to Dublin at discount prices, and thence to military hospitals in the various theatres of war. The dressings, their work has been described by Pádraig Yates as, and I quote, one of the most important initiatives in voluntary involvement of women in the World War I war effort. The enterprise was funded on the proverbial shoestring. In 1915-16 there was a small grant from the Central Depot, which together with the profit from the teas and some donations funded the depot's work for the year. Financial year 1916-17 included £200 from money raised at a Red Cross race meeting, profits from the tea department again, tea is always very central, some financial donations, one of which was £19 5 from Miss Wood from the sale of some of her family silver. To conclude, the depot continued on its work for some months after the end of the Great War, in response to requisitions from the War Office. On the closing of the military hospitals, these requisitions ceased and the sphagnum organisation was demobilised in February 1919. It had worked almost without a break from November 1915 to February 1919, organised 45 sub-depots and about 200 moss collecting centres throughout the country, supplied surgical dressings to over 60 hospitals, and had a total output of all its work of 967,000 items. The women hung up their uniforms and went home, quite often to... Many of them had lost family, all of them had lost friends in the war, and they went home to home in a very different Ireland to that of 1914. The work of two of its officers, Elsie Henry the quartermaster and B. O'Brien, was acknowledged and they were awarded OBEs in 1918. Other people were offered them and turned them down. They accepted them on behalf of the organisation. However, after these OBEs were awarded, all the work of the depot and the women who worked there was forgotten. And as for sphagnum moss, its medicinal properties were acknowledged, and there were several initiatives in Ireland, Britain and the States after the war to seek it to be produced on a commercial basis. This is particularly after the outbreak of the Second World War. None of these was successful. The collection of the moss and the making of the dressings is very labour intensive. What made the production of sphagnum moss dressings viable during the Great War was the voluntary work done by the collectors, by the hundreds of women in Ireland. Thank you.
I was very glad to receive the invitation to contribute to this prestigious conference, and we've already heard some very illuminating addresses on the whole subject of women in the World War. The appropriateness of Emma Duffin, the subject of my talk, as a subject may be seen in two ways. On International Women's Day last year, 2017, there was a blue plaque unveiled to Emma Duffin by the Ulster History Circle, of whom you've seen an example earlier on, at the place where she was born in University Square, Belfast. The second reference is the granting of female suffrage, as you've seen here, in 1918, is commonly being marked this year. And Emma kept a record of her experiences in a very literate sort of way, and her own contribution to education and the whole role of the political profile of women can become apparent by a reading of her diaries. But I also want to say I'm very glad to be, pass a less warm vote of thanks to the organisers of this conference for putting me on last. And for making me, as it were, the last man standing between you and your lunch. So if you'll bear with me, I'll skip. Michael, even take my watch off and never remind me.
No, you're okay. So what to pass?
Right.
I just want to do questions quickly and
Okay.
people can speak.
I understand. Okay. The War Office estimated in the early 1920s that at least 23,000 committed and educated young females throughout Britain, Ireland and the British Empire were enlisted in the voluntary aid detachment of the Red Cross and St John Ambulance Service. Of these 23,000, some 1,200 are considered to have enlisted in Ireland. The voluntary aid detachment initiative had been instigated as early as 1909 in a joint initiative between the British Red Cross and the Order of St John. Emma Duffin, born in Belfast in 1883, likewise applied at the age of 31, by which time she had achieved some standing as an illustrator of children's books. She applied to enlist as a VAD nurse. She was called up in September 1915, reported to London, and was immediately sent by boat to Alexandria in Egypt, where she spent the next 6 months as a nurse, tending to casualties evacuated from Gallipoli. Until then, the most concentrated military engagement and British disaster of the First World War. On her return, after 6 months in Alexandria, she re-enlisted, and in 1916 was sent to several hospitals in Le Havre and Calais in northern France, where she spent the rest of the war. She would tend nurse the wounded, Allied and German soldiers as they were stretchered in increasingly large numbers from the Western Front. Her family background, never work with children, animals and machines you don't understand, as W.C. Field once said. Sorry, I should have asked you.
You can use those when you
Right.
use the ruler mouse.
Okay. That is Emma Duffin in her VAD uniform. She served 1915 to 19, and she was made an assistant nurse, and then was mentioned in dispatches. That's her in her as a book illustrator, and she was also honorary secretary of the Belfast Council of Social Welfare. She was one of 7 sisters, all educated at Cheltenham Ladies College, in the equivalent of Eton. So there was no shortage of money in the family. Her father was a stockbroker at the time when Belfast was the fastest growing city in the British Isles in the last quarter of the 19th century. So she, with her sisters, was of that ilk. She herself was sent to, went to Germany as an au pair just before the outbreak of the First World War. So the impact of having spent time in Germany and having a range of German friends from her time there gave her a certain cachet and also a certain notoriety, as we'll see, when she worked with the professional nurses in the hospitals, because as the German soldiers were stretchered in increasingly large numbers, she then was able to parley with them, something that didn't entirely endear her to her female professional colleagues. The 1911 census records everyone in the household in University Square as non-Unitarian, that's non-subscribing Presbyterians, except for the 2 Catholic maids. 3 of Emma's sisters also served in the World War I as VADs. They were based in England. And her brother, Captain Terence Duffin, who served in the Ulster Division, 36th Ulster Division, was awarded the Military Cross. As I say, she went to Germany in 1911, and she then went back. I just want to say a note here, because as was mentioned, the diaries are in the Public Record Office. She wasn't all that, she didn't write them as a historical record. She didn't write the diaries at the time because of the nature of her work. She wrote them up based on the voluminous correspondence she and her sisters sent back to her mother during the First World War, and it's part of the absolutely enormous Duffin family archive that's here in the Public Record Office. So those diaries, those letters that she sent back, she then formed the basis of the journals that she wrote up. 5 relating to the First World War, and a very interesting one relating to her time here during the Belfast Blitz in the 1940s. Another story. Her call-up papers arrived in September 1915. She reported to the Red Cross headquarters at St John's Gate, London, to find herself bound for Egypt. When she arrived in Alexandria in late 1915, where a considerable number of casualties from the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign of that year had been sent, curiously, the great majority of the cases that she encountered initially were suffering from dysentery, a reflection of the trials of service in the Mediterranean. In fact, as she somberly records, it was not for some months that she even saw a soldier who had been wounded in action. Worst of all, her first stint on duty in the wholly new and literally foreign environment of the Alexandria Hospital was on night shift, during which time she was often left on her own through the night, long hours of the night, with a ward full of seriously ill patients. Hectic and constant as the demands of the wards were, these were increased immeasurably when the convoys of trains from there arrived. The night she dreaded, sorry, I beg your pardon. say in Belfast, this is a disaster. Her first Christmas, she was served in 1915 from September to March 1916. And all that time, she was constantly devoted to the soldiers. During that time, the whole time of in the First World War, she, as was echoed earlier on, the British Tommy was her hero. He was so selfless, he was so patient, stoical, cheerful, and long-suffering that she would do anything for them. The only time she felt slightly abashed attending to these men was she was sent to the officers' hospital, people from her own class. She felt that slightly discomforting. But her record, and she didn't question the pointlessness of the war at all until it came to Christmas in Alexandria. Having served there for 3 tempestuous months on the wards in Alexandria, she allowed herself what was almost her first moment of reflection as she retired to bed on Christmas night 1915. A reflection that took into account the fruitful and happy time she had spent only 2 years earlier in Germany as an au pair. The medical staff at the hospital in Alexandria had agreed that they would all work on Christmas Day and devote it all to the patients, and had sung carols and distributed presents to them. These men, you see, were so badly wounded they couldn't even be put on ships to be taken back to England, so they were completely adrift from home altogether. No, I want to just find it. Dear oh dear. Anyway, she makes a comment during her that she retired to bed that night and said, you know, she looked back on her time that they'd sung the hymns to the patients. It reminded her when she was in Germany, they'd done exactly the same thing. They'd gone around to the local hospital and they'd sung hymns and Christmas carols. And then she reflected, they must be doing the same in Germany now. And it gave her a lot of offence that, you know, her friends, or people whom she had thought her friends, were now doing such serious damage to the men that she attended so tenderly. And she said it would give somebody, if somebody arrived from outside to see these two people, two nations in such conflict, and yet they were doing the same thing on Christmas Day, singing to in their hospitals. It made her reflect on the pointlessness of war that didn't last very long. She was posted to the Western Front, and the extent of the injuries and care of the wounded she acquired initially in Le Havre constantly shocked her. Nonetheless, she recounted her feelings, particularly in cases where there was unfolding humans with care. There was a man desperately ill in a ward, she said, shot through the chest, and his wife arrived with his baby daughter, which she had never seen. It was a constant feature that people could come over from England to visit their loved ones in the hospital. She sat by him night after, and this is the wounded soldier's wife. She sat by him night after night, and the baby slept in an empty bed in the corner of the ward. And in the mornings, always smiling and chuckling and crowing, was handed from bed to bed. She even made her way onto the ward, and one of our few up patients could be seen in the morning, full of pride, in the possession of her, walking up and down in the balcony, whistling to her. The work was unrelenting, and she frequently makes a note about how strenuous she found it. It was not only the responsibility of the care of so many seriously ill soldiers, but the demands of the very difficult cases. She was always quick to point out that instances of obstreperous and difficult patients were very rare. I found night duty there very strenuous, she said. We had to watch the head cases, these people with badly injured heads, as they were inclined to hop out of bed at every occasion. The heart boy, she called him, was a great trial too. He refused to take his medicine and any nourishment, refused to be washed, even raising his fist and using awful language. It was all I could do to keep him in my patience with him. I hate you, nurse, he said to me one day. And on another occasion, he even used the Pygmalion word. Bloody. And I made him apologise, and I think we were better friends after that, though he hated us all, poor boy. The nurses were entitled to 1 half-day off per week, but such were the demands made in the hospitals, especially the arrival of convoys carrying hundreds of wounded patients requiring urgent attention. Their leave was often cancelled and unclaimed. On top of the work, they were often subjected to the evacuations and other emergency measures that accompanied the warnings of imminent air raids. She struggled to cope with the rigours and demands that VAD nurses had to cope with, and while on night duty, often on their own in a ward full of up to 100 wounded men, too seriously injured to be shipped back. She graphically describes the impact of the arrival of trains laden with wounded survivors. In Le Havre there were a series of hospitals, which weren't hospitals at all, of course. The Gare, the Hospital de la Gare, was the converted railway station. The hospital of the Hotel des Emigrants was just a converted hotel that was used to accommodate the increasing numbers of wounded soldiers. So she was shipped from venue to venue, as it were, in Le Havre, wherever she went. She graphically describes the impact of the arrival of trains laden with wounded survivors. I had not been on night duty very long when the big push began, and the trains came, and the boats did not come fast enough, and we worked all night and came on duty again after breakfast, and prayed and looked for the boats. I was sent on duty on the station platform, and if the hospital had not made me realise the war, I realised it that night. Under the big arc lights in the station lay stretchers 4 deep, as close one could scarcely fit one's feet between them, all down the station. At the end of the station were the walking cases. They were just walking past, and the majority had been huddled together, their arms in slings and their heads bound up, the mud from the trenches still sticking to their clothes, and the blood still caked on them. I walked up and down all night, feeling I was in a bad dream. The convoys arrived during the summer of 1916 and 17 included not only Allied soldiers, a number were increasingly laden with German prisoners and requiring hospital treatment in the Havre and Calais hospitals where she served. All as seriously injured as the British soldiers. Furthermore, Emma had some intriguing comments to make on the treatment the German prisoners were subjected to. She said it in her diary. Then came a big convoy of Germans. Some of the Germans were terribly badly wounded. We were short of sheets, and naturally and rightly enough, our own men came first. They had what sheets there were. The Germans lay on brown blankets, which gave them a neglected look. To a certain extent they were neglected too, but the staff was inadequate. It was a physical impossibility for me to wash all the helpless men. Enemies or not, she said, they had terrible wounds, and I hated to see them lying unwashed in the dirty brown blankets, but I could not help it. One poor creature, shot through the stomach, was sick all night. During the air raid alarm, I crept along in the dark to his bed several times, but there was nothing I could do to ease him. He asked for a bit of cotton wool, which he dipped continually in a bowl of water and sucked it. In the morning I made time to wash him myself. Poor soul, I knew he would not be there long. With tears running down his cheeks, he thanked me. Schwester, das Agnes Conway, das Sie so viel für den Warden. His sister, she said, I didn't expect you would do that so much for me. His pathetic humility, she said, nearly made me cry. Schwester, he said, I cannot live. You know I am dying. I do not know what I answered, she said, but he must have read the answer on my face. For myself, said the German prisoner, I don't mind. I am glad. But my poor old mother, it will kill her. She had but 3 of us. The other 2 have been killed. When I came on duty the next day, she said, I saw that his bed was empty and he was dead. My first thought was, poor old German mother. She narrates a story of 2 other German prisoners, which I won't go into in view of time, but they're they're fetching, not least because, in a sense, it does demonstrate that she herself was regarded by her colleagues, both VAD nurses and professional nurses, as being slightly too soft in the direction of the Germans. And it didn't give her any great discomfort, but it was something that she sort of couldn't help drawing to attention. Emma remained in Le Havre until near the end of the war. In 1915 she was promoted to assistant nurse, Until then, great care had been taken not to refer to the VAD nurses as nurses. And the changes in the regulations just before the end of the war served as a recognition of the VAD's worth during it. However, Emma resented this move towards professionalism and without articulating in so many words, appears to have prized the volunteer role that the term VAD attributed to her. She deplored the assistant nurse term all the more when it became apparent that many of the volunteer VAD nurses were being asked to apply to full-time nursing courses after the war, while not being given any accreditation for the long years they had spent in hospitals. Most of the VAD nurses who were offered then to have a 3-year nursing course reduced to 2 years and to be attracted to the nursing profession, most of them said, not in your life. The news of the armistice on 11th November 1917 prompted a great sense of celebration and so on. But what she did was, she wanted to go up and see all the battlefields that she wasn't there, and all the men had talked to her about. So she then gets, I'll maybe just go through at this stage, Emma's just family background. Her mother was Maria Duffin, was the granddaughter of William Duffin, William Drennan, who began the society. And that's the nature of her diaries in the record office. On duty in Alexandria, she took a camera with her, and of course, being an unofficial nurse in that sense, she was able to negate military regulations, and she took unusual enough photographs. As I say, she was a book illustrator, so she had a good graphic eye. Unusual enough photographs of patients in Alexandria. Diary. That's her at the Hotel des Emigrants with other soldiers. And she had also the presence of mind to note the names of the people. Officers' Hospital Le Havre. Leave of absence rarely granted. And that's a photograph of one of the little Huns, as she called them, Max Zubrutta, who had died eventually, as most of them did, but she was able to parley with him in German and build up quite a relationship with him. And then, where I broke off, in 1919, in the early years of 1919, while she was still coping with the impact in the hospitals of the great Spanish flu epidemic, which is estimated to have killed as many as 20 million people, as many as were killed during the conflict of the First World War. And she then stayed on, was only demobbed in March 1919, but insisted that, and she sort of almost commandeered 2 doctors who had a car to go up and see the impact of the devastation in places like Ypres that soldiers had talked about, wipers as they called it. And I was lucky enough earlier last year, to have been at the celebrations, the commemorations in Ypres for the commemoration of the contribution of the Irish to that part of the war. And so I was able to visit Ypres Cathedral, which is, as you know, much restituted. Like many of the nurses that we've heard earlier on today, she was mentioned in dispatches, this time on about 4,000 of them, I think, mentioned in the dispatches announced on the 31st of December, 30th of December 1918. She was given an honorary MA in Queen's University in 1954. She was buried in Newcastle, County Down, with some of her sisters and one of her brothers-in-law. Only 2 of the 7 Duffin sisters married. Yeah. So I end on that note. I actually thought I had another one. So you're welcome to ask me questions, and is there going to be a question session now?